The text message glowed in the darkness. Tonight, we finally show up together. No more excuses about leaving Madeline at home. Madeline Carter's hands trembled as she read the words again. 8 years. 8 years of sacrifice, strategy, and silent brilliance while her husband built an empire with her mind and another woman on his arm. But Ethan Caldwell had made one fatal mistake. He'd underestimated the woman he'd hidden. If you're ready to witness the most devastating takedown in corporate history, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The foundation of Madeline Carter's world cracked on a Tuesday night in November. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No shouting, no confrontation, just the soft glow of a phone screen illuminating the bedroom she'd shared with Ethan Caldwell for 8 years. The same bedroom where she'd reviewed countless contracts, drafted expansion strategies until 3 in the morning, and celebrated his victories as if they were her own. The text message was still open on his phone when he stepped into the shower. Madeline had only glanced at it by accident, reaching for her own device on the nightstand. But once she saw those words, she couldn't look away. Tonight, we finally show up together. No more excuses about leaving Madeline at home. I'm tired of being your secret. See. Madeline sat motionless on the edge of their bed, the Egyptian cotton sheet suddenly feeling like sandpaper against her skin. Her breathing remained steady. Years of courtroom training had taught her to control physical reactions even when her mind was screaming. She listened to the shower running, steam creeping under the bathroom door, and felt something cold and crystalline forming in her chest. Not heartbreak, clarity. She opened her laptop and began to type. 3 weeks earlier. Madeline, I need you to look at the Jakarta contract one more time. Ethan had appeared in the doorway of her home office, the converted guest room where she spent most of her days now. He looked hurried, distracted, already pulling at his tie in that way he did when stress built up behind his carefully maintained exterior. The Jakarta contract. Madeline looked up from the market analysis she'd been reviewing. I went through that twice already. The tariff structures are sound, and the partnership framework protects us if their government regulations change. I know. Ethan moved into the room, setting his briefcase on the chair across from her desk. But Morrison from the board had some questions about the exit clauses. Can you just simplify the language? Make it more accessible? Madeline felt the familiar tightness in her jaw. You mean rewrite the section I spent 4 days researching, so it sounds like it came from a business magazine instead of someone with a law degree? Don't be like that. His tone shifted to the gentle condescension that had become increasingly common over the years. You know how these guys are. They want reassurance, not legal jargon. She saved her document without responding. Ethan walked behind her desk, placing his hands on her shoulders. She could smell his cologne, the expensive one she'd given him for their anniversary. You're brilliant at this, he said softly. You know that, right? I couldn't do any of this without you. Madeline stared at her screen, at the complex trade analysis she'd spent weeks developing. Then maybe you should tell them that. Tell who? The board. Morrison. Anyone. She turned in her chair to look up at him. Ethan, I used to be a corporate attorney. I had a career. Now I spend my days doing uncredited work while while I what? Build a company that supports both of us? His hands dropped from her shoulders. Madeline, we've talked about this. You chose to step back from the firm. You said you wanted to help me build something together. I did. I do. The words felt automatic now. I just thought together meant something different. Ethan glanced at his watch, a subtle gesture, but one she'd learned to recognize. He was already moving toward the next thing, the next meeting, the next person who needed his attention. I have to get to the office, he said. Chloe scheduled that investor call for 3, and I still need to prep. Can you have the Jakarta revisions to me by tonight? Chloe. Madeline repeated the name carefully. Your assistant. Executive assistant, Ethan corrected, already gathering his briefcase. She's been invaluable with coordinating the international partnerships. Really sharp. How old is she? The question seemed to surprise him. I don't know, 26, 27. Why does that matter? It doesn't. Madeline turned back to her computer. I'll have the revisions sent over by 6. Ethan paused in the doorway. "You're upset." "I'm fine." "Madeline, the Jakarta contract, Ethan. You said you needed it tonight." He lingered for another moment, and she could feel his hesitation, his desire to smooth over whatever tension hung in the air between them. But the investor call won. It always did. "We'll talk later," he said. "Maybe go to that Italian place you like this weekend." Madeline didn't answer. She listened to his footsteps retreating down the hallway, the front door opening and closing, his car starting in the driveway. Only then did she allow herself to close her eyes and breathe. The house felt enormous in the silence. She'd given up her corner office at Patterson and Rhodes for this. Given up the partnership track, the courtroom victories, the professional identity she'd spent years building. When Ethan had come to her 5 years ago with his vision for Caldwell Global Imports, she'd believed in him. More than that, she'd believed in them. The idea of building something together, of using her legal expertise and strategic mind to help him succeed, had felt romantic. Revolutionary, even. "We'll be partners in everything," he'd promised. "Your name will be on this too." But somewhere between the business plan and the reality, her name had disappeared. The strategies she developed became the team's recommendations. The contracts she drafted were reviewed by our legal department, a department that consisted of her and a part-time paralegal. The expansion models that had taken Caldwell Global from a regional player to an international presence were attributed to executive leadership. Madeline opened her filing cabinet and pulled out the folder she'd been compiling for the past year. Inside were copies of every major contract she'd authored, every market analysis, every strategic framework that bore Ethan's signature instead of her own. She'd started keeping them almost unconsciously at first, a kind of professional diary. But lately, she'd been adding to it with more purpose. She wasn't sure why. Some instinct she didn't want to name. Her phone buzzed with an email. Ethan, already at the office, forwarding her a message chain about the Jakarta deal. His note at the top said simply, "Can you handle this?" Of course she could handle it. She handled everything. Madeline picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. David Morrison, board member, Caldwell Global Imports. She'd met him at exactly 3 company functions, each time introduced as Ethan's wife, with no mention of her background or contributions. She composed a message, then deleted it. Composed another, deleted again. What would she even say? "Hello, Mr. Morrison. I'm the person actually doing the legal work you're questioning. I have a law degree from Columbia and spent 6 years in corporate litigation, but my husband prefers to keep that quiet." She set the phone down and returned to the Jakarta contract. That's what she did. That's what she'd always done. She worked. The night Madeline discovered the text message, Ethan had been preparing for the International Trade Council Gala, the event of the year for anyone in global commerce. It was where deals were made, partnerships were forged, and reputations were built or destroyed under crystal chandeliers. Madeline had attended the gala with Ethan for the past 3 years. She'd stood beside him in designer gowns, made polite conversation with investors' wives, and watched him network with the precision of a master craftsman. Last year, she'd even helped him prepare his speech for the keynote panel, staying up until midnight to refine his talking points about ethical supply chains. But this year, things were different. "I think it's better if I go alone this time," Ethan had told her 2 weeks ago over breakfast. "It's going to be a lot of business talk. You'd probably be bored." Madeline had looked up from her coffee. "I've never been bored before." "I just mean, it's heavy on the networking this year. Lots of one-on-one investor conversations. I'll be working the room all night." He'd smiled, the same charming smile that had first attracted her at a law school mixer a decade ago. "Why don't you take the evening for yourself? Go to that spa you like. My treat." She should have known then, should have recognized the lie in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, in the casual tone that worked too hard to sound casual. But she'd wanted to believe him, had needed to believe that her husband, her partner, wasn't actively excluding her from the professional world they'd supposedly built together. Now, standing in their bedroom with his phone in her hand, she understood the truth with devastating clarity. Ethan wasn't going alone. He was going with Chloe. Madeline set the phone back exactly where she'd found it and moved to her closet. Her hands were steady as she pulled out her laptop and opened a new encrypted folder. She'd learned years ago to protect sensitive files, a habit from her litigation days that had never quite left her. She began to type, her fingers moving with mechanical precision across the keyboard. Project Reclamation. Confidential. Phase 1. Documentation. She worked through the night while Ethan slept beside her, his breathing deep and undisturbed. She compiled every contract she'd ever written for Caldwell Global, every strategic analysis, every market expansion model, every single document that bore Ethan's signature but contained her intellectual property. By dawn, she had a comprehensive portfolio of her own work, dated, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with company filings that would prove she'd been the architect behind Caldwell Global's most significant growth periods. Phase 2. Intelligence gathering. Madeline knew the corporate world well enough to understand that documentation alone wouldn't be enough. She needed leverage. She needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with, not just Ethan's affair, but the full scope of his deception. She started with the obvious places. Ethan's computer, which he left logged in more often than not. His email accounts, both personal and professional. The shared cloud storage where he kept company files. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. The affair with Chloe had been going on for at least 14 months based on the email timestamps. The messages were a nauseating mix of professional collaboration and personal intimacy. Chloe sending him revised presentation decks that Madeline had actually created, Ethan praising her for brilliant insights that had originated in Madeline's home office. But it was the recent messages that made Madeline's blood run cold. "When are you finally going to tell her?" Chloe had written 6 months ago. "Soon. I promise. I just need to figure out the right timing. You've been saying that for a year, E. I'm not going to be your secret forever." "You're not a secret. You're my future. Madeline is complicated." "Complicated how? You said the marriage has been over for years." "It has been, but she's contributed to the company. I need to handle this carefully. Make sure she can't claim any ownership when we divorce." Madeline read that line 3 times. Make sure she can't claim any ownership. So this was the strategy. Keep her invisible. Keep her contributions uncredited. Then, when he was ready to trade her in for a younger model, he could walk away with everything while positioning her as nothing more than a stay-at-home wife who'd never actually worked. The cold clarity in her chest crystallized into something harder, something diamond-sharp. Phase 3. Strategic Alliance. Madeline opened a new browser window and searched for a name she'd seen in industry publications for years. Victor Alvarez, CEO of Alvarez International Trade Corporation. Ethan's biggest competitor, the man who'd been trying to break into the European markets that Caldwell Global currently dominated. She found his company website, his bio, his recent interviews. In one article from 6 months ago, Alvarez had spoken about his frustration with the current state of industry ethics, specifically calling out unnamed competitors for taking credit for others' work. Madeline opened a new email account under a pseudonym and began to compose a message. "Mr. Alvarez, you don't know me, but I have information about Caldwell Global's European expansion strategy that I believe would be of significant interest to you. More importantly, I can provide you with insight into systematic intellectual property misattribution that has been occurring within the company for the past 5 years. If you're interested in a conversation about ethical business practices and the importance of proper credit for strategic innovation, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you discreetly. I will contact you again in 1 week with a proposed meeting location. Respectfully, a concerned industry professional." She sent the email before she could second-guess herself. Son. Ethan came home that evening with flowers. Expensive roses from the boutique florist downtown. "For my brilliant wife," he said, kissing her cheek as he handed them over. "I know I've been distracted lately. The gala prep has been consuming everything." Madeline accepted the flowers with a smile. "They're beautiful." "I was thinking," Ethan continued, loosening his tie as he walked toward the kitchen. "After the gala is over, why don't we take that trip we've been talking about? Paris, maybe. Or the Amalfi Coast, just the 2 of us." "That sounds wonderful." Madeline filled a vase with water, her movements careful and precise. "When is the gala again?" 2 weeks from Saturday." Ethan pulled a beer from the refrigerator. "I know I said you didn't have to come, but I've been reconsidering. Maybe it would be good for us to be there together. Show a united front." Madeline's hand paused on the vase. What changed your mind? I don't know. I guess I just miss having you beside me at these things. He moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You always know exactly what to say to people, how to make them feel comfortable. She leaned back against him, feeling the familiar warmth of his chest against her shoulders. For a moment, just a brief, treacherous moment, she wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that this version of Ethan was real, that the messages on his phone were some kind of misunderstanding, that 8 years of marriage meant something more than elaborate deception. But then she remembered the words, "Make sure she can't claim any ownership when we divorce." "I'd love to come," she said softly, "if you're sure I won't be in the way." "Never." He kissed the top of her head. "You could never be in the way." Madeline closed her eyes and smiled. She had 2 weeks to prepare for the most important performance of her life. Phase 4. Transformation. Madeline had always been beautiful in an understated way, the kind of beauty that came from good bone structure and careful maintenance rather than dramatic flair. She wore her dark hair in a simple style, favored classic clothing in neutral colors, and kept her makeup minimal. It was the aesthetic of a serious professional woman, someone who wanted to be taken seriously for her mind rather than her appearance. But for the gala, she needed to be unforgettable. She started with her appearance. A consultation with a high-end stylist in the city, someone who specialized in red carpet transformations. She showed the woman a single photograph, a European socialite she'd seen in a magazine, all sharp elegance and commanding presence. "I want to look like power," Madeline said. "Not pretty, not approachable. Power." The stylist's eyes gleamed with understanding. "I know exactly what you need." The dress came first. Emerald silk that moved like water, cut to emphasize every line of her figure without being obvious about it. The color was deliberate, bold enough to command attention in any room, sophisticated enough to signal serious wealth and taste. Then came the hair. The stylist convinced her to go darker, adding rich chocolate undertones that made her skin look luminous. The style was sleek and modern, pulled back in a way that emphasized her bone structure and made her dark eyes impossible to ignore. Makeup was an art form. The stylist worked for nearly an hour, creating a look that was dramatic without being theatrical. Smoky eyes that suggested mystery. Lips in a deep wine shade that commanded attention. When Madeline looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back at her looked like someone who owned empires. Someone who made boardrooms fall silent when she spoke. Someone who had never, not even for a moment, been hidden. "Perfect," she whispered. Victor Alvarez responded to her email within 48 hours. They met at a private club in the city, the kind of place where discretion was guaranteed and conversations stayed confidential. Madeline arrived as Madeline Moreau, close enough to her real name to feel natural, different enough to maintain distance. She'd crafted an identity as a consultant for a European investment consortium, someone with deep knowledge of international trade and significant connections in the financial world. Alvarez was in his early 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. He rose when she entered the private dining room, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Miss Moreau," he said, "thank you for agreeing to meet." "Mr. Alvarez," Madeline shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate your discretion." They ordered coffee, and Madeline got straight to business. "I have detailed knowledge of Caldwell Global's European expansion strategy," she said. "Not just the public-facing information, but the actual strategic framework that's driving their success in markets you've been trying to penetrate for years." Alvarez leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "And why would you share this information with me?" "Because I believe in proper attribution of intellectual property, and because Ethan Caldwell has built his reputation on work that isn't his own. You sound like you have personal knowledge of this." "I do." Madeline met his gaze steadily. "I've spent 5 years watching someone take credit for strategies and analyses that came from someone else's expertise. I've watched that person build an empire on stolen intellectual capital while keeping the actual architect completely invisible. And you're willing to prove this? I can provide documentation, dated files, comparative analysis showing the origin of every major strategic initiative Caldwell Global has implemented in the European market." Madeline paused. "But I want something in return." "Of course." Alvarez smiled slightly. What do you need? I need you to attend the International Trade Council Gala. I need you to be particularly attentive when discussions turn to intellectual property rights and ethical business practices. She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. And I need you to be prepared to ask very specific questions about the origins of Caldwell Global's recent success. Alvarez opened the folder. His expression shifted as he scanned the documents inside. Strategy memos, market analyses, expansion frameworks, all bearing Madeline's digital signature and timestamps that predated their implementation at Caldwell Global by months. This is extraordinary work, he said quietly. Whoever created these strategies understands European market dynamics better than anyone I've ever seen. Thank you. Madeline allowed herself a small smile. I worked very hard on them. Alvarez looked up sharply. You're the architect. I am. And Caldwell has been passing these off as his own? Not just passing them off, building his entire reputation on them while keeping me, she paused, choosing her words carefully, completely out of sight. Alvarez closed the folder slowly. Miss Moreau, I have to ask, why come to me with this? Why not simply expose him yourself? Because exposure isn't enough. Madeline's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. I don't want to be a whistleblower or a scorned woman telling her side of the story. I want to reclaim my professional identity in a way that can't be dismissed or diminished. And that requires the right stage, the right audience, and the right moment. The gala. Exactly. Alvarez was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that might have been admiration. You're not just looking for revenge. You're looking for resurrection. I'm looking for what's rightfully mine. My work. My reputation. My name. Madeline leaned forward slightly. And I'm willing to share strategic intelligence with you in exchange for your support when the time comes. What kind of support? The kind that validates my credibility when I make my revelation. The kind that comes from a respected industry leader who's known for his commitment to ethical business practices. She paused. I need someone the room will listen to when I tell them who I really am. Alvarez considered this, then extended his hand across the table. You have my support, Ms. Moreau, or should I say, Mrs. Caldwell. Madeline shook his hand but didn't correct him. Not yet. She wouldn't be Mrs. Caldwell for much longer. But the week before the gala, Madeline made one final preparation. She contacted her former mentor from Patterson and Rhodes, Margaret Chen, now a senior partner specializing in intellectual property and divorce litigation. They met for lunch at Margaret's favorite restaurant, a quiet place where lawyers talked strategy over expensive wine. Madeline Carter, Margaret said warmly, embracing her former protege. It's been too long. When you left the firm, I thought you'd disappear into domestic bliss forever. Things change, Madeline said simply. They ordered, and Madeline laid out the situation with clinical precision. The affair, the intellectual property theft, Ethan's plan to divorce her while claiming she'd contributed nothing to the company. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing sharper with each revelation. How much documentation do you have? She asked finally. Madeline pulled out her tablet and showed Margaret the comprehensive file she'd compiled. Every contract, every analysis, every strategic memo, all properly dated and attributed. This is bulletproof, Margaret said, scrolling through the documents. With this kind of paper trail, you could claim substantial ownership in Caldwell Global, possibly majority ownership if we can prove you were the primary strategic architect during the company's growth phase. That's exactly what I need. Madeline took a sip of wine, but I need the filing to be perfectly timed. When? The Monday after the International Trade Council Gala. I want the divorce papers and the intellectual property claim filed simultaneously before he has a chance to hide assets or create counter-narratives. Margaret's eyes gleamed with professional appreciation. You're not just leaving him, you're dismantling him. I'm reclaiming what's mine, Madeline corrected. Everything else is just consequence. I'll have everything prepared, Margaret promised. Papers ready to file the moment you give the word. But Madeline... She paused, her expression softening slightly. Are you sure about this? Once you start this process, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over and things will get very ugly very quickly. Madeline thought about the past 8 years, the countless nights working in her home office while Ethan took credit for her brilliance, the slow erosion of her professional identity, the casual dismissal of her contributions, the text messages arranging to finally show up with another woman at the industry's biggest event. Make sure she can't claim any ownership when we divorce. I've never been more sure of anything, she said quietly. Margaret nodded. Then let's make sure you win. Yeah. The night before the gala, Ethan was electric with nervous energy. This is going to be huge, he said, pacing their bedroom while Madeline sat at her vanity, removing her makeup. Morrison told me there are going to be 3 major international investors there specifically to talk about expansion partnerships. If I can close even one of those deals, we're looking at doubling our European presence. That's wonderful, Madeline said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. I've been going over the pitch all week. The strategy for European expansion that you... He paused, catching himself. That we developed. It's solid. They're going to love it. I'm sure they will. Ethan moved behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders just as he had weeks ago in her office. But this time, Madeline didn't tense. She didn't feel anything at all. I'm glad you're coming tomorrow, he said softly. It means a lot to have you there. Madeline turned in her chair to look up at him. Ethan, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever think about what I gave up for you, for the company? He looked genuinely confused. What do you mean? My career, my partnership track at Patterson and Rhodes, my professional identity. She kept her voice gentle, curious rather than accusatory. Do you ever think about what that cost me? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hands still resting on her shoulders. I think you made a choice to support our family, to build something together. Did I build something? Or did I build something for you? Madeline, it's okay. She stood, breaking his hold on her shoulders. I'm not angry. I'm just curious what you think I've contributed. He looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot. You've contributed everything. You know that. I couldn't have done any of this without your support. My support, she repeated. Not my strategy? Not my legal expertise? Not my market analyses? That too, of course. All of it. He reached for her hand. Where is this coming from? Madeline smiled, squeezing his hand gently. Nowhere. I've just been thinking about the future lately, about what comes next. What comes next is we keep building, Ethan said, relief evident in his voice. Together, like we always have. Together, Madeline echoed. Right. She kissed him on the cheek and excused herself to the bathroom. Once the door was closed, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Not the woman she'd been, but the woman she was becoming. Tomorrow night, the world would finally see her, and Ethan Caldwell would learn what it meant to underestimate the mind he'd tried to hide. The International Trade Council Gala was held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, a palace of marble and crystal that had hosted presidents and royalty. Madeline arrived separately from Ethan, claiming she needed to stop by her sister's house first, a sister who didn't exist, but Ethan didn't question it. He was already at the venue, probably with Chloe, making their pre-entrance arrangements. Madeline checked into a room at the hotel under her pseudonym, Madeline Moreau. She told Ethan she would meet him in the ballroom, that she wanted to make sure her dress looked perfect before making an entrance. He'd laughed, kissed her, told her she always looked perfect. Now, standing in the hotel room, Madeline carefully applied her makeup exactly as the stylist had shown her. The transformation was even more dramatic than she'd remembered. The woman in the mirror was powerful, mysterious, completely in control. She slipped into the emerald silk dress, feeling the fabric settle against her skin like armor. Diamond earrings, her own, inherited from her grandmother, never worn because Ethan preferred her jewelry to be subtle. Patent leather heels that added 3 inches to her height, a small clutch that contained only her phone, lipstick, and a flash drive with copies of all her documentation. She was ready. Madeline took the service elevator down to avoid any chance of running into Ethan early. She'd arranged with Victor Alvarez to enter through a side entrance to give herself time to survey the room before making her presence known. The ballroom was even more spectacular than she'd remembered from previous years. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors. Women in designer gowns and men in perfect tuxedos gathered in clusters, champagne glasses glittering in their hands. This was where power congregated, where fortunes were made and broken with a handshake. Madeline spotted Ethan immediately. He stood near the center of the room, Chloe Bennett at his side. She was younger than Madeline had imagined, probably not even 25, blonde and polished in a white cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She laughed at something Ethan said, touching his arm with casual intimacy. No one seemed to find it strange. No one questioned why Ethan Caldwell's wife wasn't with him, because no one knew Madeline Carter existed as anything more than a name on a marriage certificate. That was about to change. Victor Alvarez appeared at her elbow, offering his arm. "Ready, Ms. Moreau?" Madeline took a deep breath and placed her hand on his arm. "Let's go reclaim my name." They stepped into the ballroom together, and Madeline felt the moment the room's energy shifted. Conversations paused. Heads turned. People noticed Victor Alvarez, a major industry player, entering with a stunning woman no one recognized. Most importantly, Ethan noticed. She watched his face across the ballroom as his eyes found her. First there was confusion. She looked familiar but different, transformed in a way he couldn't quite process. Then recognition began to dawn, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that might have been fear. Madeline smiled, and the game began. Victor Alvarez guided Madeline through the ballroom with the practiced ease of someone who had attended 1,000 such events. They moved slowly, deliberately, allowing the room to absorb their presence. Madeline could feel eyes following them, curious, speculative, trying to place the striking woman in emerald silk who commanded attention with every step. "Half the room is wondering who you are," Victor murmured, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "The other half is wondering how they can get an introduction." "Good," Madeline replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. "Let them wonder." Across the ballroom, Ethan stood frozen, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips. Chloe was still talking, her hand on his arm, but he wasn't listening anymore. His entire focus had narrowed to the woman in green moving through his world like a beautiful hurricane. Madeline watched him through her peripheral vision, noting every micro-expression that crossed his face. The confusion, the dawning recognition, the flash of something that might have been panic quickly masked by his professional smile. She didn't approach him. Not yet. Instead, she allowed Victor to introduce her to a cluster of European investors she'd never met in person, but whose portfolios she knew intimately from her research. They greeted Victor warmly, then turned their attention to her with obvious interest. "Gentlemen, may I present Madeline Moreau?" Victor said smoothly. "She's a consultant with the Beaumont Investment Consortium out of Geneva, specializes in international trade strategy and market expansion in emerging European markets." Madeline extended her hand to each man in turn, her grip firm and confident. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Alvarez has told me so much about the innovative work you've been doing in Eastern European logistics. You're familiar with our operations?" One of the investors, a silver-haired German named Klaus Werner, looked pleasantly surprised. "I make it my business to understand the key players in any market I'm analyzing," Madeline replied. "Your approach to navigating the regulatory complexities in Poland was particularly elegant. The partnership structure you developed avoided the typical pitfalls while maintaining flexibility for future expansion." Werner's eyebrows rose. "You've done your homework, Miss Moreau. Most consultants I meet can barely distinguish between Warsaw and Prague." "Most consultants haven't spent years studying European market dynamics," Madeline said with a slight smile. "I believe in understanding not just the numbers, but the cultural and political contexts that drive those numbers." The conversation flowed naturally from there. Madeline discussed tariff structures, regulatory frameworks, cultural considerations, and business negotiations, all topics she'd mastered over years of invisible work for Caldwell Global. The investors listened with genuine interest, asking questions that she answered with precision and depth. She could feel Ethan watching from across the room, could sense his confusion deepening into something closer to alarm. His wife didn't talk like this at parties. His wife made polite small talk and smiled quietly while he worked the room. His wife certainly didn't hold court with major European investors while discussing complex trade policy. But then, Ethan had never really known what his wife could do. "Miss Moreau," another investor interjected, "I have to say, your analysis sounds remarkably similar to some of the strategic frameworks I've seen coming out of Caldwell Global. Have you consulted with them by any chance?" Madeline's smile didn't waver. "I'm familiar with their work, yes, Though I'd say it's less that I sound like them and more that they've implemented certain strategies that follow established best practices in the field. Established by whom? Werner asked with genuine curiosity. By people who understand that successful international expansion requires more than aggressive ambition, Madeline said carefully. It requires detailed market analysis, cultural sensitivity, and a willingness to build genuine partnerships rather than simply extracting resources. Victor caught her eye briefly, a flicker of approval in his expression. She was laying groundwork, planting seeds that would bloom later in the evening. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes before the investors began drifting toward other clusters, promising to continue the discussion later. As they dispersed, Victor leaned closer to Madeline. "That was masterful," he said quietly. "You have them intrigued without revealing anything they could use against you later." "I learned from the best," Madeline replied. Then, after a pause, "Unfortunately, he never gave me credit for the education." Before Victor could respond, a familiar voice cut through the ambient conversation. "Madeline." She turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral. Ethan stood 3 feet away, Chloe still at his side, both of them staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed horror. "Ethan," Madeline said pleasantly, "what a surprise to see you here." His face was struggling to process the transformation. This wasn't his wife, the quiet, understated woman who worked in her home office and avoided the spotlight. This was someone else entirely. Someone powerful and polished and completely in control. "What?" he started, then seemed to catch himself. "What are you doing here? I thought you were meeting me at the entrance." "Change of plans," Madeline said smoothly. "I ran into Mr. Alvarez at the hotel, and he was kind enough to escort me in. You know how overwhelming these events can be when you arrive alone." Victor extended his hand to Ethan with perfect politeness. "Caldwell, good to see you. I've been having a fascinating conversation with Ms. Moreau about European market strategy. She has some truly innovative insights." Ethan shook Victor's hand mechanically, his eyes never leaving Madeline's face. "Ms. Moreau?" "I prefer to use my maiden name in professional context," Madeline explained, her tone light and unconcerned. "It avoids confusion." "Professional contexts," Ethan repeated slowly. His publicist's smile was starting to crack around the edges. "Madeline, can I speak with you privately for a moment?" "Of course." She turned to Victor with a gracious nod. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Alvarez, thank you for the introduction." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Moreau." Victor's eyes held a glint of amusement. "I look forward to continuing our conversation later this evening." Madeline allowed Ethan to guide her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, acutely aware of Chloe trailing behind them like an uncertain shadow. When they reached a spot partially shielded by an elaborate floral arrangement, Ethan finally released her arm and turned to face her. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. "I'm attending a professional event," Madeline replied calmly. "Exactly what you invited me to do." "You told me you were coming as my wife, not as—" He gestured at her dress, her appearance, the entire transformation. "Whatever this is, I'm still your wife, Ethan. I'm just also a professional with expertise in international trade strategy. Is there something wrong with that?" Chloe shifted uncomfortably beside Ethan. Up close, she looked even younger than Madeline had first assessed. Pretty in a calculated way, with the kind of polished perfection that came from expensive salons and personal trainers. She wore her confidence like borrowed jewelry, shiny but not quite fitting right. "Hi," Chloe said, extending her hand with a brightness that felt forced. "I don't think we've officially met. I'm Chloe Bennett, Ethan's executive assistant." Madeline shook her hand briefly. "Madeline Carter. Though, as I mentioned, I prefer Moreau in professional settings." "Right." Chloe glanced at Ethan, clearly uncertain how to navigate this situation. "Ethan's told me so much about you." "Has he?" Madeline's smile was pleasant, empty. "How interesting. He's barely mentioned you at all." The barb landed. Chloe's smile faltered slightly, and Ethan's jaw tightened. "Madeline," he said quietly, "what are you doing?" "I'm networking," she replied, "making professional connections, establishing my presence in the industry, all the things you do at events like this." "You don't need to establish a presence. You're here as my guest." Actually, I'm here as a representative of the Beaumont Investment Consortium. Mr. Alvarez arranged my invitation weeks ago. The lie came easily, smoothly, completely believable. The fact that I'm also your wife is incidental. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The Beaumont Investment Consortium? You don't work for them. Don't I? Madeline tilted her head slightly. How would you know? We barely discuss my work anymore. You've been so busy building your empire that I doubt you could tell me what I've been doing for the past 6 months. You've been working from home, helping with... He stopped himself, glancing at Chloe. Helping with what? Madeline prompted gently. Please, finish your sentence. I'm curious what you think I've been contributing. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tensions. Chloe looked increasingly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Ethan and Madeline as if watching a tennis match she didn't understand the rules of. Finally, Ethan leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We'll talk about this at home. Right now, I need you to dial this down. These people are important to my business. Your business? Madeline repeated softly. Right. How could I forget? Madeline, enjoy your evening, Ethan. She stepped back, smoothing the silk of her dress. I'm sure you and Ms. Bennett have a lot of networking to do. Don't let me interrupt. She turned and walked away before he could respond, her heels clicking against the marble floor with satisfying precision. Behind her, she heard Chloe's confused whisper, "What just happened?" But she didn't turn back. Victor found her at the bar, ordering a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking. She just needed something to hold, something to occupy her hands while her heart raced with adrenaline. That looked intense, Victor observed, accepting his own drink from the bartender. He's rattled, Madeline said quietly. Good. He should be. Half the room is already asking me about the mysterious Ms. Moreau. Victor sipped his champagne. I've been dropping careful hints that you have deep expertise in European trade strategy. By the end of the night, everyone will be curious about where that expertise came from. Perfect. Madeline scanned the ballroom, noting the various clusters of conversation, the flows of power and influence moving through the space like invisible currents. Who else should I talk to? The panel discussion starts in 20 minutes, Victor said. Ethical practices in international trade. Ethan is one of the keynote speakers. Madeline's pulse quickened. I remember. He's been preparing for weeks. I'm also on the panel, Victor continued. I've made sure the moderator has some very specific questions prepared about intellectual property rights and proper attribution of strategic innovation. Will Ethan know the questions are coming? Not unless he's psychic. Victor's smile was sharp, but I imagine he'll figure it out quickly enough once they start. The lights in the ballroom flickered once, twice, the signal that the program portion of the evening was about to begin. Guests began moving toward the rows of chairs arranged in front of a raised stage. Madeline and Victor found seats in the third row, close enough to see every expression, but not so close as to draw immediate attention. Ethan mounted the stage with 3 other panelists, all of them titans of international trade. He looked confident, comfortable, in his element. He'd given dozens of talks like this, charming audiences with his vision for ethical global commerce while privately cutting corners and stealing credit wherever convenient. Madeline watched him adjust his microphone, flash that $1,000,000 smile at the audience, and settle into his chair with the easy grace of someone who believed he belonged there. The moderator, a respected journalist named Patricia Hammond, introduced each panelist with brief biographical sketches. When she reached Ethan, Madeline listened to her own work being described as his achievements. Ethan Caldwell has revolutionized Caldwell Global's approach to European market expansion, Patricia said, implementing innovative strategies that have become industry benchmarks for ethical and effective international trade. Madeline's fingers tightened on her champagne glass. Beside her, Victor leaned closer and whispered, Patience. Your moment is coming. The discussion began with softball questions about market trends and regulatory challenges. Ethan answered smoothly, deploying the talking points Madeline had helped him develop over years of private strategy sessions. He spoke about transparency, partnership, respect for local markets, all while failing to mention that every framework he referenced had originated in someone else's mind. Then Patricia shifted gears. I'd like to discuss something that's been getting attention in our industry lately, she said, her tone becoming more serious. The question of intellectual property and proper attribution in corporate strategy. We've seen several high-profile cases where junior employees or consultants developed innovative approaches that were then claimed by senior executives. Ethan's smile didn't waver, but Madeline saw his shoulders tense slightly. Mr. Alvarez, Patricia continued, you've been vocal about this issue. Can you elaborate on why you think proper attribution matters in our industry? Victor leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. It matters because trust is the foundation of international business. When we misrepresent the origins of our strategies or take credit for work we didn't do, we're not just being unethical, we're undermining the very principles that make cross-cultural commerce possible. Can you give us an example? Patricia asked. I can give you several, Victor replied. I've seen companies claim proprietary methodologies that were actually developed by uncredited consultants. I've seen executives build entire reputations on white papers and analyses authored by people whose names never appear in any public documentation. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Madeline kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt the temperature rising. Patricia turned to Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, your company has been particularly successful in recent years. Can you speak to how you ensure proper attribution of strategic innovation at Caldwell Global? Ethan's smile was smooth, practiced. Absolutely, Patricia. We have a rigorous internal review process. Every major strategic initiative is vetted by our executive team, and we make sure to recognize the contributions of everyone involved. Everyone? Victor interjected gently, including non-executive contributors, consultants, support staff who might be developing strategic frameworks behind the scenes? Ethan's eyes flicked to Victor, a brief flash of irritation crossing his features before he masked it. Of course, we believe in collaborative development. Great strategies come from great teams. Interesting, Victor said. And do you publicly acknowledge the specific individuals who develop those strategies? Or does the credit typically flow to the executive level? The tension on stage was palpable now. The other panelists looked uncomfortable, sensing conflict brewing beneath the polite discourse. I think that's a false dichotomy, Ethan replied, his tone still pleasant but with steel underneath. In collaborative environments, it's often impossible to attribute specific ideas to specific individuals. Strategies evolve through conversation and iteration. But someone usually originates the core framework, Victor pressed. Someone does the actual analytical work, develops the initial models, creates the intellectual architecture that others then build on. Don't they deserve recognition for that foundational contribution? In theory, yes, but in practice, it's easier to let executives take credit for work done by people who aren't in the room, Victor finished. People who might not have the platform or the power to demand recognition. The audience was completely silent now, everyone sensing they were witnessing something more than a theoretical debate. Patricia, ever the professional, tried to redirect. This is clearly a passionate topic. Mr. Caldwell, can you speak specifically to how Caldwell Global has approached these questions? Ethan straightened in his chair, his composure returning. I can speak to the fact that we value every member of our organization. Our success has been built on collective effort, and I'm proud of the team we've assembled. But can you name them? The question came from the audience, a woman's voice, clear and carrying. Madeline stood slowly, every eye in the ballroom turning toward her. She felt the weight of their attention, the curiosity and speculation. This was it, the moment she'd been planning for weeks. I'm sorry, Patricia said from the stage, shielding her eyes against the lights. Do you have a question? I do, Madeline said clearly. Mr. Caldwell just spoke about valuing every member of his organization and the collective effort behind his company's success. I'm curious if he can name the individuals who developed the European expansion framework he referenced earlier, the one that's become an industry benchmark. Ethan stared at her, his face draining of color. I don't think, because from what I understand, Madeline continued, her voice steady and projecting perfectly across the silent ballroom, that framework was developed by a single individual who spent months conducting market research, analyzing regulatory structures, and creating detailed partnership models. Someone who never received public credit for that work. Ms. Moreau, Patricia said, I appreciate your engagement, but this is a panel discussion, not a... My name isn't actually Moreau, Madeline interrupted gently. That's my maiden name, which I've been using professionally this evening. My married name is Carter, Madeline Carter, I'm Ethan Caldwell's wife." The ballroom erupted in whispers. Madeline heard gasps, exclamations, the sudden buzz of shocked conversation. On stage, Ethan looked like he'd been struck. "I'm also," Madeline continued, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the murmurs, "the person who developed the European expansion framework Mr. Caldwell has built his reputation on, along with most of the other strategic initiatives Caldwell Global has implemented over the past 5 years. That's not—" Ethan started to stand, but Patricia gestured for him to remain seated. "Ms. Carter," Patricia said carefully, "those are significant claims. Do you have evidence to support them?" "I have comprehensive documentation," Madeline replied. "Dated files showing the development of every major strategy Caldwell Global has implemented, market analyses, contract frameworks, expansion models, all authored by me, all implemented without attribution." She pulled the flash drive from her clutch, holding it up so the audience could see. "I'd be happy to share this documentation with anyone interested in examining the question of intellectual property rights in our industry. It's a fascinating case study in how brilliance can be systematically erased when it's convenient for those in power." The room had gone from buzzing to absolutely silent. Every eye moved between Madeline and Ethan like spectators at a championship match. Ethan finally found his voice. "Madeline, you're making a scene. These are wild accusations based on 5 years of comprehensive documentation," Madeline said calmly. "Based on contracts I wrote, analyses I conducted, strategies I developed while you took credit in boardrooms and at events exactly like this one." "You helped," Ethan said, his desperation starting to show. "Of course you helped. We worked together as partners." "Did we?" Madeline's voice was soft but cutting. "Because I don't remember you mentioning my name once in any public forum. I don't remember seeing my name on any bylines or presentations or strategic documents. I remember working until 3 in the morning on expansion models that you presented as your own vision. I remember writing contracts that bore your signature instead of mine." Chloe had appeared at the edge of the stage, her face pale and uncertain. She looked at Ethan, then at Madeline, clearly trying to understand what was happening. "Tell me, Mr. Caldwell," Victor said from the stage, his voice cutting through the tension. "Did your wife contribute to your company's strategic development, or didn't she?" Ethan's mouth opened and closed. He looked trapped, caught between admitting Madeline's contributions and maintaining the fiction he'd built his reputation on. "She contributed," he finally said. "Of course she contributed. But the ideas were collaborative. Were they?" Madeline interrupted. "Because I have emails showing you asking me to develop specific strategies. I have drafts with my edits and my analytical frameworks. I have time-stamped documents proving that every major initiative came from my research, my analysis, my strategic vision." She took a step forward, her voice strengthening. "I have proof that while you were building Caldwell Global's reputation, I was building Caldwell Global's strategy. And I have proof that you systematically erased my contributions while positioning yourself as a visionary leader." "This is absurd," Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're my wife. We're a team. Everything I've built for us." "You've built it on my work," Madeline corrected, "and you've done it while planning to divorce me and ensure I can't claim any ownership of the company my strategy created." That stopped him cold. His face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat. "I've seen the messages, Ethan," Madeline said quietly, but her voice carried in the absolute silence of the ballroom. "The ones where you discuss making sure I can't claim ownership when you finally end our marriage. The ones where you talk about keeping me invisible so that when you're ready to move on with someone younger, someone who looks better on your arm at events like this, you can walk away with everything while I'm left with nothing." Chloe made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. She turned to Ethan, her face crumbling. "You said you were separated. You said the marriage was already over." "Chloe," Ethan reached for her, but she stepped back. "You said she knew," Chloe whispered. "You said she was fine with it." "I think," Patricia said into her microphone, her journalist instincts taking over, "we should take a brief recess to allow everyone to—" "No," Madeline said firmly. "I don't need a recess. I need everyone in this room to understand what happened here. I need the industry that celebrated Ethan Caldwell as a strategic genius to know that the strategies came from someone else, someone he kept hidden, someone he planned to discard once she'd outlived her usefulness. She looked directly at Ethan, and for the first time all evening, allowed her rage to show. You took my career, you took my identity, you took years of my life and my brilliance, and you used them to build something that bore only your name. And you did it while making me believe we were partners. We are partners, Ethan said desperately. Madeline, please, we can talk about this privately. We're done talking privately, Madeline said. We're done with me working in the shadows while you stand in the spotlight. We're done with your lies and your manipulation and your systematic erasure of my contributions. She turned to address the entire ballroom, her voice ringing clear. My name is Madeline Carter. I have a law degree from Columbia and 6 years of experience in corporate litigation. I've spent the past 5 years developing the strategic frameworks that turned Caldwell Global from a regional importer into an international presence. And starting Monday, I'll be filing for divorce and claiming my rightful ownership of the intellectual property I created. The room erupted. Questions flew from every direction. Journalists reached for their phones. Investors clustered together, whispering urgently. The careful order of the gala dissolved into chaos. Madeline stood at the center of it all, calm and certain, finally visible after years of being hidden. She caught Victor's eye. He gave her a small nod of approval, then stood and offered her his arm. Shall we? He said quietly. Madeline took his arm and allowed him to escort her out of the ballroom, leaving behind the wreckage of Ethan's carefully constructed empire and the beginning of her resurrection. Behind her, she heard Ethan calling her name, heard the desperate edge in his voice as his world collapsed around him. She didn't look back. The cameras were already waiting when Madeline and Victor emerged from the Grand Meridian Hotel. Flashbulbs erupted like small explosions, journalists shouting questions over each other in a cacophony of voices. Madeline felt Victor's arm steady under her hand, anchoring her as they navigated through the crowd toward the waiting car. Ms. Carter, is it true you developed all of Caldwell Global's European strategies? How long have you known about the affair? Will you be filing for divorce? Miss Moreau, or is it Carter, can you comment on your allegations? Victor's driver opened the car door, and Madeline slid inside, grateful for the sudden quiet as the door closed behind them. Through the tinted windows, she could see the journalists still shouting, cameras still flashing, the feeding frenzy she'd unleashed showing no signs of slowing. That went well, Victor said dryly, settling into the seat beside her. Madeline laughed, surprising herself. The sound was slightly hysterical, edged with adrenaline and disbelief. I just destroyed my husband's career in front of 300 people. I'm not sure well is the word I'd use. You exposed the truth, Victor corrected. There's a difference. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be rapidly accumulating messages. My assistant says the business press is already running the story. Bloomberg, Reuters, Financial Times, they've all picked it up in the last 20 minutes. That fast? That's the thing about truth bombs at high-profile events, Victor said, his tone almost admiring. Everyone in that room had a phone and a Twitter account. Your revelation went viral before you even left the building. Madeline's own phone had been vibrating constantly in her clutch. She pulled it out now, the screen lighting up with notifications. Texts, emails, missed calls, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, from numbers she recognized and many she didn't. One text caught her attention. Margaret Chen, her attorney, sent just 5 minutes ago. I saw the live stream. Brilliant execution. Come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We need to move quickly on the filing before Ethan has time to hide assets. Also, you're trending on Twitter. Welcome to viral fame. Madeline showed the message to Victor, who chuckled. Margaret's not wrong. By tomorrow morning, you'll be the most talked about woman in international business. The question is, are you ready for what comes next? What comes next? Madeline echoed, feeling the weight of what she'd just done beginning to settle onto her shoulders. Scrutiny, Victor said bluntly. Every aspect of your marriage, your work, your claims, it's all going to be examined under a microscope. Ethan's not going to accept this quietly. He'll fight back, probably claim you're exaggerating or lying or having some kind of breakdown. Let him try, Madeline said, her voice hardening. I have documentation, years of it. Time-stamped files, email chains, everything anyone would need to verify my claims. Good, Victor replied, because you're going to need every piece of evidence you have. This is war now, Madeline. Corporate war, legal war, public relations war. Are you prepared for that? Madeline thought about the past 8 years, the quiet erosion of her identity, the slow transformation from respected attorney to invisible support staff, the moment she'd read that text message and understood that she'd never actually been a partner, just a resource to be used and eventually discarded. "I've been preparing for this my entire marriage," she said quietly. "I just didn't know it until 2 weeks ago." The car pulled up in front of a boutique hotel in the financial district. Not the hotel where Madeline had checked in earlier, but a different property entirely. Victor had insisted on the precaution, concerned that journalists or Ethan himself might track her to her original location. "Get some rest," Victor advised as they stood in the lobby. "Tomorrow is going to be intense. The media attention alone will be overwhelming, not to mention everything you'll need to handle with Margaret." "Thank you," Madeline said, suddenly overwhelmed by gratitude for this man who'd become an unexpected ally. "For everything, for believing me, for supporting me, for helping me find the courage to do what I just did." Victor's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me. What you did tonight, standing up and reclaiming your narrative, that took courage I'm not sure I could have mustered. I'm honored to have played a small part in it." After he left, Madeline rode the elevator to her room in a state of numb exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the first stirrings of emotional reaction to what she'd done. She'd destroyed Ethan's reputation, publicly, spectacularly, in front of everyone who mattered in their industry. Part of her. The part that had loved him, that had believed in their partnership, that had sacrificed so much for his success, felt a pang of something that might have been regret. But it was a small pang, quickly overwhelmed by the larger truth. He'd been destroying her for years, just more slowly and quietly. She'd simply returned the favor with interest. Her phone rang as she was changing out of the emerald dress, an unknown number which she almost didn't answer, but some instinct made her pick up. "Madeline." Ethan's voice raw with emotion she couldn't quite identify. Anger, desperation, fear? "You shouldn't be calling me," Madeline said calmly, putting the phone on speaker so she could continue undressing. "Anything you need to say should go through lawyers." "Lawyers?" Ethan's laugh was bitter. "You just humiliated me in front of the entire industry, and you're talking about lawyers." "I told the truth," Madeline corrected. "If that humiliated you, perhaps you should have considered the consequences before systematically erasing my contributions for 5 years. I never erased you. Everything I built for us." "Don't," Madeline interrupted sharply. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was ever about us." "I've seen the messages, Ethan. I know you were planning to divorce me and make sure I couldn't claim any ownership of the company my work built. So please, spare me the injured husband routine." Silence on the other end. Then, in a voice that had lost all pretense of righteousness, "What do you want?" "I want what I've always deserved," Madeline replied. "Credit for my work, compensation for my intellectual property, and a divorce from a man who valued my brilliance only when he could claim it as his own." "You're going to destroy Caldwell Global," Ethan said flatly. "Is that what you want? To tear down everything we built out of spite?" "I'm going to reclaim what I built," Madeline said. "What happens to Caldwell Global after that isn't my concern. You should have thought about the company's stability before you decided to steal from and betray the person who made its success possible." "Madeline, please." She hung up before he could finish. Then she blocked his number, deleted the call from her history, and turned off her phone entirely. She was done listening to Ethan Caldwell's excuses. The next morning arrived with brutal efficiency. Madeline woke to find her hotel room door being pounded on, someone shouting her name from the hallway. When she looked through the peephole, she saw hotel security escorting a journalist away, the woman still calling out questions about the gala revelation. "How did they find me?" Madeline muttered, grabbing her phone to call the front desk. "Miss Carter, I'm so sorry," the manager said, genuine distress in his voice. "We're not sure how the press learned your location. We're moving you to a more secure floor immediately. In the meantime, we're clearing the hallway and have called the police about the trespassing journalists." 20 minutes later, Madeline was installed in a suite on the hotel's executive floor, accessible only by key card and with security stationed in the hallway. The manager delivered her breakfast personally, along with profuse apologies and assurances that her privacy would be protected. Over coffee and pastries she barely tasted, Madeline finally turned her phone back on. The notification avalanche was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of messages, missed calls, emails. She scrolled through them with growing disbelief, trying to process the sheer volume of response her revelation had generated. Messages from former colleagues at Patterson and Rhodes expressing shock and support, emails from journalists requesting interviews, texts from women she'd never met, thanking her for speaking out about invisible labor and intellectual property theft. Even a few messages from investors she'd met at previous galas, some sympathetic, others clearly calculating how this scandal might affect their portfolios. And buried among all the others, a message from someone she hadn't expected. David Morrison, the Caldwell Global board member whose questions about the Jakarta contract had prompted one of her many uncredited strategy revisions. Ms. Carter, I've just learned the full truth about your contributions to Caldwell Global's strategic development. I'm appalled that I participated, however unknowingly, in the erasure of your work. If you're willing to speak with me, I'd like to discuss how the board might address this situation. We take intellectual property violations very seriously. Madeline stared at the message, feeling something shift in her chest. This was real. This was actually happening. The revelation she'd made at the gala wasn't just a moment of cathartic truth-telling. It was the beginning of actual consequences for Ethan's systematic theft of her work. She forwarded Morrison's message to Margaret with a brief note. Thoughts? The response came almost immediately. Don't respond yet. Let me reach out to him officially, and get to my office as soon as you can. We have a lot to discuss. Margaret's office was in a sleek high-rise in the city's legal district. Madeline arrived via the building's underground parking garage, a precaution Margaret's assistant had suggested to avoid any journalists who might be staking out the main entrance. Her attorney was waiting in the conference room, surrounded by stacks of documents and looking energized in a way that suggested she'd been up all night preparing. First things first, Margaret said, gesturing Madeline to a seat. How are you holding up? I'm not sure, Madeline admitted. I feel like I'm in shock mostly, like I'm watching this happen to someone else. That's normal. What you did last night took extraordinary courage, and the adrenaline crash is real. Margaret poured them both water from a carafe on the table. But we need to move quickly while the momentum is on our side. Ethan's going to mount a defense, and we need to be several steps ahead of him. What kind of defense? The obvious one, claiming you're exaggerating your contributions, that the work was collaborative, that you're making false accusations because of the affair. Margaret pulled out a legal pad covered in notes. He might also try to suggest you're having some kind of emotional breakdown, that you're not thinking clearly. Madeline felt anger flash through her. Of course. Discredit the woman by questioning her mental state, classic. Which is why we're going to be meticulous and strategic, Margaret continued. We're filing 2 separate legal actions today. First, divorce proceedings with a comprehensive claim on marital assets, including your intellectual property contributions to Caldwell Global. Second, a formal intellectual property claim against the company itself, seeking recognition and compensation for your strategic frameworks. Can we do both simultaneously? Not only can we should, Margaret said firmly. The divorce establishes your right to marital assets. The IP claim establishes your professional contributions independent of the marriage. Together they create an airtight case for your ownership stake in the company. She slid a thick folder across the table to Madeline. I've drafted preliminary filings based on the documentation you provided. I need you to review them carefully and let me know if anything is inaccurate or incomplete. Madeline spent the next hour reading through page after page of legal language that translated her lived experience into formal claims and arguments. Seeing her work documented this way, every strategy memo, every market analysis, every framework she'd developed, cataloged, and attributed with clinical precision was surreal and validating in equal measure. This is thorough, she said finally. Incredibly thorough. It needs to be, Margaret replied. Ethan's legal team is going to challenge every claim you make. We need evidence so comprehensive that no reasonable judge could dismiss it. What about the board? Morrison's message suggested they might take action independently. I've already reached out to him, Margaret said. We're meeting with the full Caldwell Global board on Monday. They're conducting an internal investigation into your claims, and Morrison indicated they're taking it very seriously. Apparently, several board members had no idea you were involved in strategic development at all. Because Ethan made sure they didn't know, Madeline said bitterly. Exactly, which is going to work in our favor. The more evidence we have of systematic erasure, the stronger your case becomes. There was a knock at the conference room door, and Margaret's assistant peeked in. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation developing. The press coverage is intensifying. CNN is running a story about invisible labor in corporate America, using Ms. Carter's case as the centerpiece. And several prominent women in business have started posting on social media about their own experiences with uncredited work. Margaret exchanged a glance with Madeline. Your story is resonating. Apparently, the assistant continued, there's now a hashtag trending on Twitter. Hashtag Hidden Architects. Women sharing stories about developing strategies, creating frameworks, doing intellectual labor that other people claimed credit for. Madeline felt something catch in her throat. Really? The assistant turned her tablet around, showing a Twitter feed filled with testimonials. Women from every industry, tech, finance, academia, entertainment, all sharing variations of the same story. Years of invisible work, brilliant ideas attributed to male colleagues or bosses, strategic innovations that disappeared into other people's success stories. You've started something, Margaret said quietly, something bigger than just your own case. Madeline scrolled through the posts, reading story after story of women who'd seen themselves in her revelation. Some were still trapped in situations like the one she'd just escaped. Others had already left, carrying the bitterness of never being acknowledged for their contributions. A few had successfully fought back and reclaimed credit for their work, but they were the rare exceptions. One post in particular caught her attention, from a woman named Jennifer Martinez who worked in pharmaceutical research. I developed the preliminary framework for a drug that's now saving lives. My boss presented it as his breakthrough. When I objected, I was labeled difficult and edged out of the project. Seeing Madeline Carter stand up gives me hope that truth might actually matter. Madeline set down the tablet, feeling the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. What do I do with this? All these women looking to me as some kind of symbol? You do what you've already been doing, Margaret said. You fight for recognition. You document everything. You refuse to accept invisibility as the price of contribution. And maybe, if we handle this right, you help change the systems that allowed this to happen in the first place. The rest of the day was consumed by legal preparation. Madeline signed documents, reviewed evidence, rehearsed potential testimony for when the cases inevitably went to court. By late afternoon, her hand was cramping from signing her name so many times, and her mind was spinning with legal strategies and tactical considerations. We're filing first thing Monday morning, Margaret said as they wrapped up. I want you prepared for the media storm that's going to follow. This is already big news, and the official filings will make it even bigger. I understand. Do you? Margaret studied her carefully. Because once we file, there's no going back. Your marriage will be publicly over. Your relationship with Ethan will be entirely adversarial, and every detail of your life together, financial, professional, personal, will be subject to legal scrutiny and public consumption. Madeline thought about the woman she'd been just 2 weeks ago, quietly working in her home office, convincing herself that invisible contribution was enough, afraid to demand recognition for fear of losing the little security she had. That woman seemed like a stranger now. I'm ready, she said firmly. Let's finish what I started. Over the weekend, Madeline stayed sequestered in her hotel suite, watching the story unfold across news channels and social media. The coverage was intense and, to her surprise, largely sympathetic. Business journalists analyzed her claims with serious attention to the intellectual property implications. Legal experts debated the precedent her case might set for collaborative work attribution. Cultural commentators discussed the broader phenomenon of women's invisible labor. Not all the coverage was positive. Conservative media outlets questioned her motives, suggested she was exaggerating her contributions to justify taking her husband's money in a divorce. Online trolls accused her of being a gold digger, a liar, a woman scorned seeking revenge. Some commentators argued that her work as Ethan's wife meant she had no right to claim individual credit for strategies developed within a marriage. Madeline forced herself to read even the hostile coverage, knowing she needed to understand the arguments she'd be facing. But she also had to step away periodically, overwhelmed by the vitriol and the casual dismissal of her documented evidence. On Sunday evening, Victor called to check on her. "How are you holding up?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I'm managing," Madeline said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "The media attention is more intense than I expected." "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Victor warned. "The formal legal filings tomorrow will create another wave of coverage. Are you prepared for that?" "I don't think you can really be prepared for this," Madeline admitted. "But I'm not backing down if that's what you're asking." "I never thought you would." She could hear the smile in his voice. "I wanted you to know that I've been contacted by several business leaders who saw what happened at the gala. They're interested in supporting you, both personally and professionally." "Supporting me how?" "Some want to offer consulting opportunities once this settles. Others are interested in your strategic expertise for their own companies. A few have even suggested creating a network of professionals committed to transparent attribution practices." Victor paused. "What you're doing is resonating with people who are tired of the old ways of doing business. People who believe brilliance deserves acknowledgement regardless of who it comes from." Madeline felt tears prick at her eyes, surprised by how much his words meant. "Thank you for telling me that. It's easy to feel isolated when you're reading hostile coverage and watching people question everything you've said." "You're not isolated," Victor said firmly. "You have allies, Madeline. People who believe in what you're fighting for. Don't forget that when things get difficult." Monday morning arrived with crystal clarity. Literally, the winter sun blazing through Madeline's hotel windows with almost aggressive brightness. She dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that projected professional authority, pulled her hair back in a severe bun, and applied makeup with precision. She needed to look like someone who made calculated decisions, not emotional outbursts. Margaret met her at the courthouse, where they were filing the divorce and intellectual property claims simultaneously. The lawyer looked energized and focused, clearly in her element. "The board meeting is at 2:00, Margaret said as they walked toward the filing office. "I've prepared a comprehensive presentation of your evidence. Morrison confirmed that the full board will be in attendance, including Ethan." "Is he required to be there?" "He's still technically CEO, so yes, though I suspect after today's meeting that's going to change." Margaret's expression was grimly satisfied. "I've also heard through back channels that several major investors are reconsidering their commitments to Caldwell Global. The reputational damage from your revelation is already affecting the company's financial position." They filed the paperwork with efficient professionalism, Madeline signing her name to documents that formally ended her marriage and initiated legal action against the company she'd helped build. The clerk processed everything with bureaucratic indifference, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that these particular filings represented one of the biggest business scandals of the year. "Done," Margaret said as they left the courthouse. "Now we wait for Ethan's response and prepare for the board meeting." The Caldwell Global headquarters was a modern glass tower in the financial district, a building that had been financed largely on the strength of the European expansion strategy Madeline had developed. She'd visited the offices many times over the years, usually to drop off documents or meet Ethan for lunch, always as Mrs. Caldwell, rather than as the strategic architect whose work had paid for the impressive lease. Walking into the building now, with Margaret beside her and a comprehensive file of evidence in her briefcase, felt surreal. The security guard in the lobby recognized her and looked confused. "Mrs. Caldwell? I heard—" "I'm here for the board meeting," Madeline said calmly. "They're expecting me." The conference room on the executive floor was already full when they arrived. David Morrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members Madeline recognized from company events. Ethan sat isolated at the far end, his lawyer beside him. A different attorney than the one who'd handled the settlement negotiations, Madeline noted. He'd apparently brought in bigger guns. Ethan looked terrible. His suit was impeccable as always, but there were shadows under his eyes and a tightness around his mouth that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. He met her gaze as she entered, and she saw a complicated mix of emotions flash across his face. Anger, hurt, something that might have been pleading. She looked away without acknowledgement and took her seat beside Margaret. "Thank you all for coming," Morrison began, his tone grave. "We're here to discuss serious allegations of intellectual property misappropriation that have been brought to the board's attention." Mrs. Carter, Your attorney has provided us with extensive documentation supporting your claims. We'd like to hear your account directly. Madeline stood, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. For the past 5 years, I've developed the strategic frameworks that transformed Caldwell Global from a regional importer into an international presence. I've authored every major market analysis, every expansion model, every partnership strategy that's driven the company's growth. And I've done it without credit, without acknowledgement, without compensation beyond the indirect benefits of being married to the CEO. She activated the presentation Margaret had prepared, and the screen behind her filled with time-stamped documents, strategy memos, market analyses, contract frameworks, all clearly authored by her and predating their implementation at Caldwell Global by weeks or months. This is the Jakarta Contract Framework, Madeline continued, advancing to the next slide. I spent 4 days researching tariff structures and regulatory requirements. The framework was implemented exactly as I wrote it, but presented to you as Mr. Caldwell's work. Click. Next slide. This is the German market entry strategy. I conducted 18 months of research into regulatory compliance and cultural business practices. Again, implemented exactly as written, again presented as Mr. Caldwell's strategic vision. She moved through slide after slide, each one documenting another instance of her invisible labor becoming Ethan's visible success. The board members watched in silence, their expressions growing progressively more troubled. The pattern is consistent across every major initiative, Madeline said. I developed the strategy. Mr. Caldwell presents it as his own. The company benefits while I remain completely invisible. This isn't collaboration where attribution got lost in the shuffle. This is systematic erasure. These are serious allegations, one of the board members said. Gerald Winters, Madeline remembered, a venture capitalist who'd invested heavily in the company's expansion. Mr. Caldwell, how do you respond? Ethan's lawyer started to speak, but Ethan waved him off. He stood, facing Madeline across the length of the conference table. Everything Madeline is saying is technically accurate, he said, his voice tight. She did contribute to the strategies we implemented. She has a brilliant legal mind and helped with the analytical work. But to suggest she was the sole architect, that's not accurate. We worked together. We discussed these strategies, refined them together. Show me one strategy document with your name on it, Madeline interrupted. One analysis you authored. One framework you developed independently of my research. Ethan's jaw clenched. That's not how collaborative work operates. It's exactly how it operates when you want to claim credit, Madeline countered. When I asked you to acknowledge my contributions publicly, you told me it would complicate the narrative. When I suggested my name should appear on strategic documents, you said it was unnecessary because we were a team. But when it came time to present those strategies to investors and boards and industry conferences, suddenly they were solely your vision. She advanced to another slide. Email chains where Ethan explicitly requested her analysis and strategic recommendations. Here's an email from 3 years ago where you asked me to develop the preliminary framework for the French market entry. I sent you a 40-page analysis. 2 weeks later, you presented it to this board as your work, with no mention of my contribution. Morrison leaned forward, studying the emails on the screen. Mr. Caldwell, did you represent that strategy as your own work to this board? I presented it as the company's strategy, Ethan said carefully. Developed by our team. What team? Madeline asked sharply. Name them. Name one other person who contributed to that framework. Silence. There was no team, Madeline continued. There was me, working in my home office, doing comprehensive research and analysis while you took credit in boardrooms and galas and investor meetings. I was the team. I was the architect. And you made sure no one knew it. She pulled out the final piece of evidence, the documents Chloe had provided, proving Ethan's systematic intent to minimize her potential ownership claims. And here, Madeline said, her voice cold, are emails where Mr. Caldwell discusses ensuring I can't claim ownership of company assets when he divorces me, where he explicitly outlines keeping my contributions invisible so that I have no legal standing to claim intellectual property rights. The board members exchanged shocked glances. Morrison's expression had gone from troubled to genuinely angry. Is this true, Ethan? He demanded. Ethan's lawyer put a hand on his client's arm, clearly advising silence. But Ethan shook him off. "I built this company," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "I secured the funding, managed the operations, maintained the client relationships. Madeline helped with strategy, yes, but without my execution, without my strategy, you'd still be running a small regional operation," Madeline interrupted. "The exponential growth that attracted your funding, that built your international presence, that made this company valuable, that all came from frameworks I developed. You didn't execute my vision, Mr. Caldwell. You claimed it." The meeting devolved into heated argument, lawyers on both sides arguing procedural points while the board tried to determine what actions were appropriate. Finally, Morrison called for a recess, asking the board to deliberate privately. Madeline and Margaret waited in a smaller conference room down the hall. Through the windows, they could see the city spreading out below them, millions of people going about their lives, completely unaware of the personal earthquake happening in this glass tower. "You did well," Margaret said quietly. "The evidence speaks for itself." "Will it be enough?" Madeline asked. "I think so." The board looked genuinely shocked, and those emails about minimizing your ownership claims, that's evidence of intent that's very difficult to explain away. An hour later, Morrison summoned them back to the main conference room. The board members looked grim, their decision clearly made. "Ms. Carter," Morrison began, "the board has reviewed your evidence and finds your claims credible and concerning. We are immediately suspending Mr. Caldwell from his CEO duties, pending a full investigation into intellectual property practices at Caldwell Global. We're also retaining an independent firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of strategic development attribution." Madeline felt her breath catch. This was real. This was actually happening. "Additionally," Morrison continued, "we want to offer you a formal consulting position with full attribution for any strategic work you've developed or will develop. We believe your expertise is valuable to this company, and we want to ensure you're properly compensated and credited moving forward." The board is also prepared to discuss a settlement regarding your intellectual property claims, another board member added. "We recognize that significant value has been created through your work, and we believe you're entitled to appropriate compensation." Madeline glanced at Margaret, who gave a small nod of approval. "Thank you," Madeline said carefully. "I'll need to discuss the specifics with my attorney, but I appreciate the board taking these allegations seriously." As they left the building, Madeline felt something release in her chest. Tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. The board had believed her. They'd seen the evidence and acknowledged the truth. Ethan's systematic erasure of her contributions was being exposed and addressed. "This is a major victory," Margaret said as they reached the street. "The board's actions validate everything you've claimed." "It's not over, though," Madeline replied. "No," Margaret agreed. "But this is how justice begins. With people in power choosing to believe evidence over comfortable fictions, and you just made them see the truth they'd been ignoring for years." Madeline looked back at the glass tower, thinking about all the hours she'd spent working to build something she'd never owned, never been credited for, never even been acknowledged as having helped create. The building stood gleaming in the afternoon sun, a monument to stolen brilliance and systematic erasure. But not anymore. Now everyone would know whose mind had built this empire, and Ethan Caldwell would finally face the consequences of mistaking someone's love for their weakness. The legal war began with surgical precision. Margaret Chen filed the divorce petition and intellectual property claim simultaneously at 9 o'clock Monday morning, exactly as planned. By 9:30, the documents had been served to Ethan at his office. By 10, the story had broken across every major business publication and news outlet in the country. Madeline watched it unfold from Margaret's conference room, monitoring the media coverage on 3 different screens while her legal team assembled the comprehensive case that would dismantle everything Ethan had built on her foundation. "Bloomberg just picked it up," one of Margaret's associates announced, reading from her tablet. The headline is, "Trade Executive Accused of Intellectual Property Theft by Wife and Former Attorney." Financial Times is running it too, another associate added. They're calling it The Hidden Architect. How one woman's brilliance built an empire she never owned. Margaret set a cup of coffee in front of Madeline, her expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Madeline said, and was surprised to find it was true. The anxiety that had plagued her for weeks had evaporated the moment she'd stood up in that ballroom and reclaimed her name. What remained was clarity, purpose, and an almost eerie sense of calm. Her phone had been ringing constantly since Saturday night. She'd turned it off after the 50th call, ignoring the increasingly desperate messages from Ethan, the curious inquiries from former colleagues, the interview requests from journalists hungry for her story. The only call she'd returned was from her mother, who had seen the news coverage and wanted to make sure her daughter was safe. "I'm proud of you," her mother had said quietly. "I know this must be terrifying, but I'm proud of you for standing up." Madeline had cried then, for the first time since the gala, not from sadness or regret, but from the sheer relief of finally being seen. Now, sitting in Margaret's conference room, she reviewed the preliminary response from Ethan's legal team with clinical detachment. It was exactly what she'd expected: denials, claims of collaborative work, suggestions that Madeline was experiencing emotional distress, and making exaggerated accusations. "They're going to try to paint you as a scorned wife," Margaret said, reading over Madeline's shoulder. "Classic strategy. Discredit your emotional state, suggest you're making unfounded claims out of hurt feelings." "Let them try," Madeline replied calmly. "I have 5 years of documentation. Every strategy memo, every market analysis, every contract revision, all time-stamped, all clearly authored by me. They can question my emotional state all they want. They can't question the evidence." Margaret's smile was sharp with approval. "I've already had 3 firms reach out asking if we need additional support." "Your story has hit a nerve, Madeline. There are a lot of people in this industry who've watched their work get stolen by people with better titles and louder voices." "Good," Madeline said. "Maybe something will actually change." Her phone, despite being turned off, had accumulated over 200 messages. When she finally powered it back on during a break in the legal review, she scrolled through them with morbid curiosity. Most were from journalists and industry contacts. Several were from former colleagues at Patterson and Rhodes expressing shock and support. A few were from investors she'd met at the gala, some offering sympathetic encouragement, others more calculating inquiries about her future plans. And then there were Ethan's messages. She read them in chronological order, watching his emotional state deteriorate with each successive text. Saturday night, immediately after she'd left the gala. "Madeline, please call me. We need to talk about this. You're making a terrible mistake." Sunday morning, "I can't believe you would humiliate me like that in front of the entire industry, after everything I've done for you." Sunday afternoon, "My lawyers say your claims are baseless. This is going to get very ugly if you don't back down." Sunday evening, "Please, can we just talk? I love you. We can work through this." Monday morning, after the legal filing, "You're destroying everything we built together. I hope you're happy." Madeline deleted them without responding. There was nothing left to say to him. Everything that mattered would be said in courtrooms and legal briefs. Margaret appeared in the doorway of the small office where Madeline had retreated to review the messages. "Ethan's lawyer just called. He wants to negotiate." "Already?" Madeline looked up in surprise. "He's panicking," Margaret said with satisfaction. 3 major investors have already pulled out of deals with Caldwell Global. The board is calling emergency meetings. His reputation is in freefall." She paused. "He's offering a settlement. 50% of the company's current valuation, plus a public acknowledgement of your contributions." Madeline considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "No." "You might want to hear the full offer before—" "I don't want 50% of what the company is worth now," Madeline interrupted quietly. "I want what I'm legally entitled to based on my intellectual property contributions. And I want it decided by a judge who can review the evidence objectively, not negotiated in backroom deals where Ethan gets to control the narrative." Margaret studied her carefully. "You understand this could take months, maybe years. It's going to be expensive, exhausting, and very public." "I understand," Madeline said, "but I didn't come this far to settle for half of what I deserve. I'm not interested in Ethan's version of fairness. I'm interested in actual justice." "Then we go to trial," Margaret said simply. "And we make sure everyone understands exactly what you built." The media coverage intensified throughout the week. What had started as a business scandal evolved into a cultural conversation about invisible labor intellectual property rights, and the systematic erasure of women's contributions in corporate environments. Madeline found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Journalists camped outside her hotel. She'd moved out of the house she'd shared with Ethan within hours of filing the divorce petition, hoping for interviews. Think pieces appeared analyzing her case as a symptom of broader workplace inequities. Social media exploded with heated debates about corporate attribution and marital assets. Some of the coverage was sympathetic. Career women who'd watched their ideas claimed by male colleagues saw their own experiences reflected in Madeline's story. Legal experts analyzed her documentation and declared her case remarkably strong, but other coverage was brutal. Conservative commentators suggested she was a gold digger trying to claim credit for her husband's success. Business publications questioned whether her contributions were truly as significant as she claimed. Online trolls accused her of destroying a good man's career out of spite. Madeline learned to ignore most of it. She focused on the legal case, working with Margaret's team to organize the mountain of evidence into an unassailable argument for her intellectual property rights. But she couldn't ignore the impact on Caldwell Global. By the end of the first week, 4 major investors had withdrawn their commitments to pending deals. The company's stock price, it had gone public 2 years ago, another achievement built on Madeline's strategic framework, dropped by 30%. Board members began calling for Ethan's resignation. Madeline told herself she didn't care. Told herself that Caldwell Global's collapse was simply the natural consequence of building an empire on stolen foundations. But late at night, alone in her sterile hotel room, she sometimes felt the ghost of what she'd once hoped for. The partnership that had never really existed, the shared vision that had only been hers. She'd loved him once. That was the part that hurt most. She genuinely believed they were building something together. 2 weeks after the gala, Madeline received an unexpected visitor at Margaret's office. "There's a Chloe Bennett in the lobby asking to see you," the receptionist announced over the intercom. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent." Madeline exchanged a glance with Margaret, who raised her eyebrows. "Your call," Margaret said, "though I'd advise recording anything she says if you do meet with her." Madeline considered refusing. The last thing she needed was a confrontation with Ethan's mistress. But curiosity won out, along with a certain morbid interest in what the young woman could possibly have to say. "Send her up," Madeline said. "And yes, we'll record it." Chloe Bennett looked nothing like the polished executive assistant who'd appeared at the gala. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face free of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, the kind of casual clothing that suggested she'd stopped caring about appearances. She stood awkwardly in the conference room doorway until Madeline gestured to a chair. "Sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "No, thank you." Chloe sat, her hands twisting in her lap. "I know you probably don't want to see me. I know I'm probably the last person you'd ever want to talk to." "You're right about that," Madeline said evenly. "So why are you here?" Chloe took a shaky breath. "Because I owe you an apology. And because I thought you should know the truth about what's been happening." "I already know the truth," Madeline replied. "You were having an affair with my husband. You helped him maintain the fiction that I was irrelevant to his success. You were part of the plan to erase me." "I didn't know," Chloe said desperately. "I swear I didn't know any of it. Ethan told me you two had been separated for over a year. He said the marriage was over and everything but paperwork. He said you'd agreed to keep up appearances for business reasons, but that you both had moved on." "And you believed him?" "Yes," Chloe whispered. "I believed him because I wanted to, because he was charming and successful and he made me feel special." She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "But I was an idiot. Just another stupid girl who thought she was different, that she was the exception." Madeline felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, quickly suppressed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because after the gala, everything fell apart. Ethan called me Sunday morning, furious. He blamed me for everything, said I'd pressured him to bring me to the event, that if I hadn't been so demanding, you never would have found out about us." Chloe's voice broke. "He said I'd ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," Madeline said quietly. "He did that himself." "I know that now." Chloe wiped at her tears. "I quit that Monday. Walked into his office and told him I was done, and that's when he showed me who he really was." "What do you mean?" Chloe reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table to Madeline. He tried to buy my silence, offered me a severance package on the condition that I sign an NDA and never speak about our relationship or anything I'd seen at the company. Madeline opened the folder. Inside was a proposed settlement agreement along with what looked like financial records and email printouts. I didn't sign it, Chloe continued, because while I was reading through all the documentation his lawyers prepared, I saw things that made me sick. Emails where he talked about you with other executives. Messages where he explicitly discussed taking credit for strategies you'd developed. Meeting notes where he outlined how to keep your contributions invisible. Madeline's hands tightened on the papers. You're giving this to me. I'm giving it to your lawyer, Chloe said, because what Ethan did to you was wrong, and I was part of it, even if I didn't understand what I was part of. She stood, her composure finally crumbling completely. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm sorry for believing his lies and for not asking harder questions and for being so blind to what was really happening. It's Carter, Madeline said softly. I'm going back to my maiden name. Ms. Carter, then. Chloe moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope you destroy him. He deserves it. After she left, Margaret picked up the folder and began reviewing its contents, her expression growing sharper with each page. This is gold, she said finally. These emails alone prove systematic intent to suppress your contributions, and these financial records show he was manipulating company assets to minimize your potential claims. She looked up at Madeline with something like awe. She just handed us everything we need to prove fraud. Madeline stared at the closed door where Chloe had disappeared. She loved him, she said quietly. You could see it. She actually loved him, and he threw her away the moment she became inconvenient. Just like he planned to do with you, Margaret observed. Yes, Madeline agreed, exactly like that. The trial date was set for late spring, 3 months away. In the meantime, Caldwell Global continued to hemorrhage value and credibility. 6 more investors withdrew their support. 2 major international partners terminated their contracts. The board of directors forced Ethan to take a leave of absence while they conducted an internal review of company practices. Madeline watched it all with detached interest. She'd expected to feel satisfaction seeing Ethan's empire crumble, but mostly she felt nothing. The anger that had sustained her through the initial revelation and the gala confrontation had burned itself out, leaving behind only a cold determination to see justice done. She started making plans for her own future. Carter Strategic Consulting was more than just a name now. It was a real business taking shape. Victor Alvarez had offered to be her first client, bringing her on to consult on his European expansion plans. 2 other firms had reached out with similar requests, drawn by the sudden visibility of her expertise. You're going to need to hire staff, Margaret observed during one of their strategy sessions. You can't run a consulting firm by yourself, especially not with the level of demand you're seeing. I know, Madeline said. I'm thinking about it. What she was really thinking about was something bigger. The past months had shown her that her story wasn't unique. Dozens of women had reached out to her, sharing their own experiences of invisible labor, stolen credit, systematic erasure. Some were wives who'd supported their husbands' careers at the expense of their own. Others were junior employees who'd watched their ideas claimed by senior executives. All of them had been made invisible by systems that valued certain kinds of power over certain kinds of brilliance. Late one night, unable to sleep, Madeline drafted a business plan for something she was starting to call the Carter Initiative. Not just a consulting firm, but a foundation dedicated to helping women reclaim their professional identities after years of invisible labor. Legal support for intellectual property claims. Career counseling for women wanting to rebuild after sacrifice. Networking opportunities that didn't require being someone's wife or assistant to gain access. She showed the draft to Margaret the next morning over coffee. Margaret read it slowly, then looked up with glistening eyes. This is extraordinary, Madeline. This could help thousands of women. It could help the women I've been hearing from, Madeline said. The ones who've been told their contributions don't matter, who've been kept out of rooms where decisions are made, who've watched other people build careers on their work. You'll need significant funding, Margaret warned. Starting a foundation while you're in the middle of a legal battle. I know it's ambitious, Madeline interrupted, but I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about all the women who've reached out to me and said, this is my story too. If I win this case, I'll have resources, I'll have credibility, I'll have a platform. She paused. And I'll have an obligation to use it for more than just my own vindication. Margaret smiled. Then we'd better make sure you win. As winter turned to early spring, the legal case intensified. Depositions were taken. Expert witnesses were retained. Madeline spent hours with Margaret's team, walking through every document, every strategy, every piece of evidence that proved her intellectual authorship. Ethan's legal team fought back hard. They brought in their own experts who claimed the strategies were obvious applications of standard business practices, nothing innovative or unique. They argued that marital collaboration made it impossible to determine individual contribution. They suggested that Madeline's legal background meant she'd always intended to use her access to company information for personal gain. But their arguments crumbled against the weight of evidence. The time-stamped documents, the email chains where Ethan explicitly requested her analysis and strategic recommendations, the comparative analysis showing how Caldwell Global's success directly correlated with the implementation of frameworks Madeline had developed. Most damaging of all were the documents Chloe Bennett had provided. The emails where Ethan discussed keeping Madeline's contributions invisible, the meeting notes about protecting himself from potential ownership claims, the systematic pattern of erasure. They're going to try to settle again, Margaret predicted, after a particularly brutal deposition where Ethan's lawyer had been forced to admit that several key strategies bore Madeline's authorship. The evidence is too strong. They can't win this at trial. She was right. 2 weeks before the scheduled trial date, Ethan's legal team requested a settlement conference. They met in a neutral conference room, lawyers on both sides of a long table. Ethan sat at the far end, looking diminished in a way Madeline had never seen before. He'd lost weight, she noticed. His suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He tried to catch her eye when she entered, but she looked through him as if he were made of glass. His lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Diane Richardson, opened with the settlement offer. Mr. Caldwell is prepared to acknowledge Ms. Carter's significant contributions to Caldwell Global's strategic development. He's willing to provide 70% of the company's current valuation, along with a public statement crediting her work. Margaret didn't even glance at Madeline before responding. That's insulting. My client is entitled to ownership shares commensurate with her intellectual property contributions. Based on our analysis, that's approximately 85% of the company's value at its peak, before Mr. Caldwell's misconduct caused its collapse. That's absurd, Richardson shot back. Mr. Caldwell built and operated the company. He secured the initial funding, maintained client relationships, managed day-to-day operations. Using strategies and frameworks developed by my client, Margaret interrupted smoothly. Without Ms. Carter's intellectual property, Caldwell Global would still be a small regional importer. The exponential growth that attracted investors and generated the company's current value was entirely the result of implementing her strategic vision. The negotiation continued for hours, numbers flying back and forth across the table. Madeline sat quietly, letting Margaret handle the tactical details. She'd given her lawyer clear parameters. She wanted fair compensation for her intellectual property, complete ownership of all strategic frameworks she'd developed, and a public acknowledgement that laid out the truth clearly and unambiguously. "We need a break," Richardson finally said, clearly frustrated. "I need to consult with my client." When the room cleared except for Madeline and Margaret, her lawyer turned to her with concern. "They're at 75% now. That's a substantial settlement, Madeline. You could walk away from this very wealthy and move on with your life." "What's the likelihood we'd do better at trial?" Madeline asked. "Honestly, about 80%. The evidence is overwhelmingly in your favor." Margaret paused. "But there's always risk in trials. Juries are unpredictable. And you'd have to testify, which means reliving all of this publicly." Madeline thought about the past months. The humiliation of discovery, the pain of understanding how thoroughly she'd been betrayed, the slow process of rebuilding herself from someone's hidden asset into her own person. She thought about the women who'd reached out to her, who'd shared their own stories of invisible labor and stolen credit. She thought about the Carter Initiative and the difference between personal vindication and systemic change. "I want to talk to him," she said. "Alone." Margaret's eyes widened. "Madeline, I don't think that's... I know it's not standard, but I need to do this." She met her lawyer's gaze steadily. Please. After a moment, Margaret nodded and left to arrange it. 5 minutes later, Ethan entered the conference room alone.
Much sense.
He closed the door behind him and stood awkwardly near the entrance, as if afraid to come closer. Madeline, he said quietly, thank you for agreeing to talk to me. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. He did, his movements careful and uncertain. Up close, he looked even worse than she'd initially thought. This was a broken man, someone who'd watched everything he'd built collapse because he'd never understood that you couldn't build an empire on stolen foundations. I'm sorry, he said. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I need you to know I'm sorry. For all of it. Are you sorry you did it? Madeline asked. Or sorry you got caught? Ethan flinched. Both, probably. I don't know anymore. He rubbed his face tiredly. I never meant for it to go this far. In the beginning, I really believed we were partners. I believed we were building something together. When did that change? I don't know. Gradually, I guess. The company got bigger, the stakes got higher, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself that the work we were doing together was really my vision, that you were supporting my ideas rather than creating them. He looked at her with something like desperation. I know that sounds insane now, but I swear that's how it felt at the time. And Chloe? Madeline's voice was steady. When did you decide I needed to be replaced as well as erased? Ethan's shoulders sagged. That was different. That was what? She pressed. Loneliness? A midlife crisis? Or just the logical conclusion of deciding I was useful but not valuable? I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan said quietly. I don't even forgive myself. But I need you to understand that I did love you. Maybe I still do. I just got lost somewhere between loving you and building an empire. Madeline studied the man she'd been married to for 8 years. The man she'd sacrificed her career for, believed in, supported through every challenge and setback. The man who'd systematically erased her contributions while planning to discard her when she became inconvenient. She felt nothing. I'm going to accept the settlement, she said finally. Hope flared in Ethan's eyes. Thank you. I know 75% is generous, but 85%, Madeline corrected, and full ownership of all strategic frameworks I developed, and a public statement that doesn't minimize or equivocate about my intellectual property contributions. Madeline, that's what you're going to agree to, she said calmly. Because if we go to trial, I'll win. You know it. I know it. Your lawyers know it. The evidence is overwhelming. And a trial means more publicity, more damage to what's left of your reputation, and the very real possibility that a judge decides I deserve even more than 85%. Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, 85%. And the public statement has to be approved by my lawyer, Madeline continued. No soft language, no suggestions that this was collaborative work where attribution got lost. Clear acknowledgement that I authored the strategic frameworks that drove Caldwell Global's growth. Fine. And one more thing. Madeline leaned forward. You're going to resign from the company. Immediately. Whatever's left of Caldwell Global after this is over belongs to me, and I don't want you anywhere near it. You're destroying everything I built, Ethan said, his voice breaking. No, Madeline corrected gently. I'm taking back everything I built that you claimed as yours. There's a difference. She stood, smoothing her skirt, preparing to leave. But at the door she paused and turned back. I really did love you once, she said quietly. I believed in us. Believed we were going to build something extraordinary together. She paused. But you never wanted a partner, Ethan. You wanted an unpaid employee who was grateful for the opportunity to make you look brilliant. And that's all you'll ever have now. A reputation built on theft and a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake someone's love for their weakness. She left him sitting alone in the conference room and walked back to where Margaret waited. We have a deal, Madeline said. Let's finish this. The settlement was finalized on a Wednesday morning in early May, in the same sterile conference room where Madeline had confronted Ethan weeks earlier. This time, the atmosphere was purely procedural. Signatures on documents, witnessed acknowledgments, the mechanical transfer of assets and rights from one party to another. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he signed the final papers. Madeline's remained steady. When it was done, Margaret collected the documents with brisk efficiency while the lawyers exchanged formal pleasantries that meant nothing. Ethan sat motionless at the far end of the table, staring at the pen in his hand as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. Madeline stood, gathering her bag and coat. She had meetings scheduled for that afternoon, potential clients for Carter Strategic Consulting, investors interested in the Carter Initiative, a radio interview about workplace intellectual property rights. Her calendar was full for the first time in years, with appointments that belonged entirely to her. Madeline. Ethan's voice stopped her at the door. She turned, one eyebrow raised in polite inquiry. What happens to the company now? He asked quietly. To Caldwell Global? That's no longer your concern, she replied. As of this morning, you have no ownership stake and no decision-making authority. What I choose to do with what's left is entirely my business. You're going to shut it down, aren't you? Sell it off in pieces. Madeline tilted her head, considering him. Is that what you think I want? Destruction for its own sake? I don't know what you want anymore. His voice carried an edge of bitterness. I thought I knew you, but the woman who stood up at that gala and demolished everything I'd built, I never saw her coming. That's because you never looked, Madeline said simply. You were too busy taking credit for my work to notice the person doing it. She paused at the door. And for the record, I didn't demolish what you built. I reclaimed what I built that you stole. There's a difference. She left him there and didn't look back. Outside the building, spring sunshine warmed her face. Margaret walked beside her toward the street, where a car waited to take them to Madeline's next meeting. How does it feel? Margaret asked. Madeline considered the question seriously. Incomplete, she said finally. The legal victory is important, but it's just the beginning. The real work starts now. Carter Strategic Consulting? That and the Carter Initiative. Madeline slid into the back seat of the car, Margaret following. I've been thinking about what you said, about needing funding to make it sustainable. The settlement gives me resources, but I need more than money. I need credibility, institutional support, partnerships with organizations that can help scale the impact. Margaret pulled out her tablet, already shifting into strategy mode. I might have some ideas about that. There are several foundations focused on women's economic empowerment that would be natural partners. And I know at least 3 law schools that would be interested in clinical programs around intellectual property reclamation. They spent the car ride sketching out possibilities, building frameworks for how the Carter Initiative could move from concept to reality. By the time they reached Madeline's first meeting, she had the outline of a plan that felt both ambitious and achievable. The meeting was with Harrison Chen, the CEO of a mid-sized tech company looking to expand into European markets. He'd reached out after reading about Madeline's expertise in the coverage of her legal case, intrigued by someone who understood both the strategic and legal complexities of international trade. Ms. Carter, he said, rising to shake her hand as she entered his office. Thank you for making time. I know you must be incredibly busy. I appreciate the opportunity, Madeline replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. Your assistant mentioned you're looking at expansion into Germany and France. Among others. Harrison pulled up a presentation on his monitor, turning it so Madeline could see. We've got a strong product, growing demand in European markets, but honestly, we're in over our heads on the strategic approach. The regulatory environment is complex, and we've already made some costly mistakes trying to figure it out ourselves. Madeline studied the presentation, a typical tech company expansion plan, heavy on optimism and light on actual market analysis. She could see the gaps immediately, the places where enthusiastic assumptions had replaced careful research. May I? She asked, gesturing toward his keyboard. At his nod, she pulled up a blank document and began typing. The first issue is that you're treating Europe as a monolithic market, but the regulatory frameworks in Germany versus France are significantly different. You need separate strategies for each market, built around their specific legal requirements and cultural business practices. She worked for the next hour, outlining a preliminary framework that addressed the specific challenges his company would face. Harrison listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he was genuinely engaged with the complexity of the problem. This is exactly what we need, he said finally. Ms. Carter, I'd like to hire you as our primary consultant on this expansion. Whatever your rate is, we'll meet it. I appreciate that, Madeline said, but I should be clear. I don't work the way most consultants do. I don't develop strategies for you to implement without acknowledgement. Every framework I create will be clearly attributed to my firm. Every presentation, every document, every strategic recommendation will carry my name and my company's branding. Harrison looked slightly surprised, then nodded with understanding. Because of what happened with Caldwell Global. Because I learned the hard way that brilliance without attribution is just unpaid labor, Madeline corrected. I'm happy to help you succeed, Mr. Chen, but I'm going to make sure everyone knows where the success came from. Fair enough, Harrison extended his hand. You have a deal, Ms. Carter. And for what it's worth, I think what you're doing, rebuilding your career on your own terms, helping other women do the same, it matters. My wife has been following your story. She says you're giving voice to something a lot of women have experienced but never knew how to articulate. Madeline shook his hand, feeling something warm and unexpected bloom in her chest. Thank you. That means more than you know. She left the meeting with her first official consulting contract and a renewed sense of purpose. This was what reclamation looked like, not just taking back what had been stolen, but building something new on a foundation of acknowledgement and respect. The following weeks fell into a rhythm of strategic work and foundation building. Carter Strategic Consulting took on 3 more clients, all of them drawn by Madeline's expertise and the visibility her legal case had generated. She hired 2 junior analysts, both women who'd left corporate positions after watching their contributions go uncredited, and began building the kind of collaborative environment she'd always wished existed at Caldwell Global. Simultaneously, the Carter Initiative took shape. Madeline partnered with 3 universities to create legal clinics focused on intellectual property rights in collaborative work environments. She established a mentorship program connecting women who'd sacrificed careers for family or partnership with professionals willing to help them rebuild. She created a grant program to help women pursue legal claims against employers or partners who'd stolen their intellectual property. The work was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Some days Madeline worked 16-hour stretches, fueled by coffee and the crystalline purpose of knowing exactly what she was building and why. Other days, she felt the weight of responsibility, all the women counting on her to succeed, to prove that reclamation was possible, to create pathways for others to follow. 6 weeks after the settlement, Madeline received an unexpected call from Victor Alvarez. "I have a proposition for you," he said without preamble. "Are you free for lunch tomorrow?" They met at the same private club where they'd first conspired months earlier. This time, Madeline arrived as herself. No pseudonym, no false identity, just Madeline Carter, consultant and foundation director with a growing reputation in her own right. "You've been busy," Victor observed as they settled at a corner table. "I've been following your progress. Carter Strategic is making waves." "We're doing good work," Madeline agreed, "thanks in large part to your willingness to be our first client. That endorsement meant everything." "You've more than earned it. Your analysis of our Eastern European expansion strategy was brilliant." Victor paused while the waiter took their orders, then leaned forward with an expression of serious interest. "Which brings me to my proposition. I want to buy Caldwell Global." Madeline's hand froze on her water glass. "You want to what?" "Buy what's left of Caldwell Global. The company still has valuable assets, client relationships, existing contracts, operational infrastructure. With proper leadership and strategic direction, it could be rebuilt into something sustainable." He studied her carefully. "But I want to do it with your involvement, not as a silent partner or invisible strategist, but as co-CEO with full public acknowledgement of your role." "Why?" Madeline asked bluntly. "You could acquire the assets without me. You don't need my permission to buy a company I'm planning to liquidate." "Because this is an opportunity for a different kind of story," Victor said. "Right now, your narrative is about reclamation and justice, which is important. But imagine if it also became a story about resurrection, about taking something that was built on theft and corruption and transforming it into a model of ethical business practice." Madeline sat back, her mind racing. She'd assumed she would sell off Caldwell Global's assets, distribute the proceeds, and move on. The idea of rebuilding it had never occurred to her. "I don't know if I want to be in the import-export business," she said slowly. "My focus right now is on consulting and the Carter Initiative." Then don't be in the import-export business, Victor replied. Transform it into something else. Use the existing infrastructure to create something new. Maybe a consultancy that specializes in ethical international trade. Maybe a training program for companies trying to implement better attribution practices. Hell, use it as the operational arm of the Carter Initiative if you want. He paused. The point is, you'd have complete authority to decide what it becomes, and you'd have my full support, both financial and reputational. Why do you care so much about this? Madeline asked. We barely knew each other before the gala. Why invest so heavily in my success? Victor was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Because 20 years ago, I watched my mother get pushed out of a company she'd helped build. She was a brilliant strategist, but she'd made the mistake of marrying her business partner, and when the marriage ended, she walked away with almost nothing. He went on to build an empire using her frameworks and her contacts, and she spent the rest of her life bitter and broken by the injustice of it. He met Madeline's eyes. I couldn't help her, but maybe I can help you, and maybe in the process we can prove that there's another way to do business. Madeline felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I need to think about this. Of course. Victor pulled a folder from his briefcase. Here's a preliminary proposal. No pressure, no timeline, just consider it. That night, alone in the apartment she'd moved into after leaving the hotel, Madeline spread Victor's proposal across her dining table and studied it from every angle. The financial terms were generous. The operational structure gave her complete authority over strategic direction. The timeline was flexible, designed to accommodate her existing commitments to Carter Strategic and the Carter Initiative. It was, objectively, an extraordinary opportunity, but it also meant diving back into the world of Caldwell Global, a company that bore her husband's name and carried the weight of her most painful betrayals. Could she really transform something so tainted into something worth building? Her phone rang, Margaret calling to check in. I heard about Victor's proposal, her lawyer said. He asked me to review the legal framework. It's solid, Madeline. Everything you'd need to protect yourself and maintain control. That's not what I'm worried about, Madeline admitted. I'm worried about whether I'm ready to take this on, whether it's too much too soon. Only you can answer that, Margaret said gently. But I'll say this, you've spent months proving you can reclaim what was stolen. Maybe it's time to prove you can also rebuild it into something better. After she hung up, Madeline walked to the window overlooking the city. Lights glittered across the skyline, each one representing someone's dream, someone's ambition, someone's carefully constructed life. She thought about all the women who'd reached out to her, sharing their stories of invisible labor and stolen credit. She thought about the pathways she was creating through the Carter Initiative, the possibilities she was opening for others to reclaim their professional identities. And she thought about the choice before her, to walk away from Caldwell Global and let it dissolve into corporate history, or to take the broken pieces and forge them into something that honored the work she'd done and the lessons she'd learned. The next morning, she called Victor. I'll do it, she said. But on one condition. We rename the company. I won't rebuild my career on Ethan's legacy, even if it's just a name. What do you want to call it? Victor asked. Madeline smiled. Carter Alvarez International. Equal partnership, equal acknowledgement, complete transparency about who built what. I like it, Victor said warmly. When can you start? The announcement of the Carter Alvarez International partnership hit the business press like a shockwave. Industry observers who'd been following Madeline's story saw it as a triumphant conclusion to her reclamation narrative. The woman who'd been erased now stepping into full visibility as co-CEO of a major international trade firm. But Madeline knew it wasn't a conclusion. It was a beginning. The first board meeting of the newly renamed company took place in early July, in a conference room that had once hosted Caldwell Global's executive sessions. Madeline stood at the head of the table, a position she'd never occupied in all her years of invisible work, and looked at the faces watching her with genuine interest and respect. Thank you all for being here, she began. I know the past months have been chaotic, and I appreciate your willingness to stay through the transition. Before we discuss the operational details of moving forward, I want to be clear about the values that will guide Carter Alvarez International. She advanced to the next slide in her presentation, a simple list she'd spent weeks refining. First, transparent attribution. Every strategy, every framework, every innovative approach that comes from this company will be clearly credited to its actual author. Junior analysts, senior executives, external consultants, everyone's contributions will be acknowledged publicly and compensated fairly. Several board members nodded approvingly. A few looked uncertain, as if waiting for the catch. Second, equitable partnership. We're going to actively recruit and promote people who've been systematically excluded from leadership. Women, people of color, anyone who's been told they're not executive material despite their brilliance. And we're going to compensate them as partners, not assistants. That could get expensive, one of the board members observed. So could the legal costs of intellectual property theft? Madeline replied evenly. I've done the math. Ethical business practices are actually quite affordable when you factor in the cost of not having them. A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the room. Third, sustainable growth. We're not interested in explosive expansion built on cutting corners and exploiting resources. We're interested in building something that lasts, that treats partners and clients with respect, that contributes positively to every market we enter. She paused, looking at each board member in turn. I understand these principles might not align with how business has traditionally been done. If anyone here is uncomfortable with this direction, I respect that, and there will be no hard feelings about transitioning off the board. But if you stay, I need your full commitment to building something different. The room was silent for a moment. Then Klaus Werner, one of the European investors who'd been at the gala, spoke up. Ms. Carter, I've been in this industry for 35 years. I've seen companies rise and fall based on short-term thinking and exploitation disguised as ambition. He leaned forward. What you're proposing is refreshing. Difficult, certainly, but refreshing. You have my full support. One by one, the other board members voiced their agreement. By the end of the meeting, Madeline had unanimous commitment to the new direction. As the room cleared, Victor lingered behind. That was masterful, he said quietly. You've completely transformed the tone in one presentation. Words are easy, Madeline replied. Following through will be harder. But you will follow through, Victor said with certainty. That's who you are. Over the following months, Madeline rebuilt Carter Alvarez International from the ground up. She restructured the executive team, bringing in leaders who shared her commitment to ethical business practices. She created formal attribution policies that required clear documentation of who developed what strategies. She established compensation frameworks that rewarded intellectual contribution regardless of title or seniority. The transformation wasn't easy. Some employees left, uncomfortable with the increased accountability. A few clients balked at the new transparency requirements. Industry skeptics predicted the company would fail, arguing that ethical business practices were incompatible with competitive success. But slowly, steadily, Carter Alvarez International began to thrive. New clients approached them specifically because of their ethical framework, tired of doing business with companies that cut corners and misrepresented capabilities. Talented strategists who'd been overlooked elsewhere found their way to the firm, drawn by the promise of actual recognition for their work. The company's reputation grew, not as the fastest or the most aggressive, but as the most trustworthy and innovative. Meanwhile, the Carter Initiative expanded beyond Madeline's initial vision. The legal clinics she'd established at 3 universities grew to 12, helping dozens of women pursue intellectual property claims. The mentorship program connected over 100 women with career advisors and industry contacts. The grant program funded 15 separate legal cases, with early victories that established important precedents about collaborative work attribution. Madeline found herself speaking at conferences, writing articles about workplace equity, consulting with legislators about intellectual property reform. Her story became a case study in business schools, a reference point in discussions about invisible labor and corporate attribution. But the work she found most meaningful happened in small moments, conversations with women who'd contacted her after seeing their own experiences reflected in her story. One afternoon in late autumn, nearly a year after the gala, Madeline met with a young software engineer named Lisa Park. Lisa had reached out through the Carter Initiative, seeking advice about a situation eerily similar to Madeline's own. I've been developing the core algorithms for our product for 3 years, Lisa explained, her voice tight with frustration. But in every presentation, every investor meeting, my boss presents them as his work. I'm listed as an implementation engineer, not the actual architect. Do you have documentation? Madeline asked. Emails, code repositories with your authorship? Anything time-stamped? Some, Lisa said. But I'm afraid if I push back, I'll just get fired. And then I'll have nothing. Madeline recognized the fear in Lisa's eyes. The same fear that had kept her silent for years, convincing herself that quiet contribution was enough, that being essential was the same as being valued. Here's what I learned, Madeline said gently. Being afraid of losing something that's already diminishing you isn't caution. It's just a slower kind of loss. She pulled out a notepad. Let's start documenting everything, every contribution, every algorithm you've developed, every email where your boss asks for your work. And then we're going to connect you with one of our partner attorneys who specializes in intellectual property in tech. I can't afford... The Carter Initiative covers the legal costs, Madeline interrupted. That's why it exists, to make sure brilliant women don't have to choose between justice and survival. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. Why are you doing this? Helping strangers like me? Because you're not a stranger, Madeline replied. You're me, 5 years ago. And I remember how desperately I wish someone had told me I deserved more than invisibility. 6 months later, Lisa won her case. Full attribution of her algorithms, back compensation for her intellectual property, and a settlement that allowed her to launch her own software consulting firm. She was the 15th woman the Carter Initiative had helped achieve similar victories, and the success stories were accelerating. On a crisp spring morning, exactly 2 years after the gala that had changed everything, Madeline stood in the lobby of Carter Alvarez International Headquarters, preparing for the official grand opening. The building had been completely renovated, transformed from Caldwell Global's old offices into something bright and modern and unmistakably new. The lobby walls featured a timeline of the company's history, including the uncomfortable truth about its origins. Madeline had insisted on complete transparency. The story of how Caldwell Global had been built on stolen intellectual property, how it had collapsed under the weight of that theft, and how it had been rebuilt with ethical practices at its core. Most companies would hide that history, Victor observed, standing beside her as they reviewed the displays. Put up some corporate artwork and pretend the past never happened. Most companies aren't trying to prove that transformation is possible, Madeline replied. If we hide where we came from, we can't demonstrate where we're going. The grand opening drew an impressive crowd. Clients, partners, industry leaders, journalists, and dozens of women who'd been helped by the Carter Initiative. Madeline moved through the gathering, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, still somewhat amazed by the fact that she was here at all. At one point, she found herself face-to-face with Chloe Bennett. Miss Carter, Chloe said hesitantly, I wasn't sure if I should come, but I wanted to see what you'd built. I'm glad you came, Madeline said, and meant it. How have you been? Better? Chloe managed a small smile. I'm working for a nonprofit now, helping women in crisis situations. Turns out almost destroying my life by believing the wrong man gave me some relevant experience. Madeline laughed despite herself. That's one way to find your calling. I've been following the Carter Initiative, Chloe continued. What you're doing, helping women reclaim their professional identities, it's incredible. I wondered if you might need volunteers. I'd like to help, if you'll let me. Madeline studied the younger woman, seeing genuine remorse and genuine desire to contribute. We always need volunteers, especially people who understand how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else's story. Thank you, Chloe said quietly. And Ms. Carter? I really am sorry for everything. I know, Madeline replied, and I've forgiven you. Not because what happened was okay, but because carrying anger takes energy. I'd rather spend building something better. As the afternoon progressed, Madeline made her way to the stage for the official remarks. She looked out over the crowd, seeing faces she recognized and many she didn't, all gathered to witness what reclamation looked like in practice. 2 years ago, she began, I stood in a ballroom not far from here and told the truth about intellectual property theft and systematic erasure. That moment changed my life, but not in the way people might assume. It didn't make me bitter or vengeful. It made me certain. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Certain that brilliance deserves acknowledgement. Certain that collaboration requires equity, not exploitation. Certain that the invisible labor performed by countless women in corporations, in partnerships, in marriages, has real value that should be recognized and compensated. The crowd listened in attentive silence. Carter Alvarez International exists because of that certainty. We're not just a trade company. We're a living argument that business can be both profitable and ethical, that success doesn't require stealing credit from those who did the actual work, that transparency and attribution make companies stronger, not weaker. She looked at Victor, standing in the front row with an expression of quiet pride. I couldn't have done this alone. I had partners who believed in these principles enough to invest in them. I had legal counsel who fought for justice even when the outcome was uncertain. I had women reach out and share their stories, reminding me that reclamation matters not just for individual vindication, but for systemic change. Madeline's gaze swept across the audience. To everyone who supported this journey, thank you. To everyone who's still fighting for recognition in environments that keep you invisible, know that your brilliance matters. Keep documenting it. Keep demanding acknowledgement. Keep building toward the moment when you can step into the light and claim what's yours. The applause was warm and sustained. Madeline stood at the podium, absorbing the sound of recognition, not for someone else's work, not as someone's hidden asset, but as herself. After the formal remarks, she retreated to her office on the top floor. The space was beautiful, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, modern furniture, a desk that bore a nameplate reading Madeline Carter, co-CEO, Carter Alvarez International. Margaret found her there an hour later, standing at the window watching the sun set over the skyline. Quite a day, Margaret observed, settling into one of the visitor chairs. Quite a 2 years, Madeline replied. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that I actually did it. You did more than reclaim what was stolen, Margaret said. You built something entirely new, something that's helping thousands of women understand their worth. Do you think it's enough? Madeline asked quietly. All the work with the Carter Initiative, the ethical business practices, the attribution policies, do you think it actually changes anything systemic? I think you've created proof that a different way is possible, Margaret replied. That's more powerful than you realize. Every woman who wins her intellectual property case, every company that implements transparent attribution because they see it working here, that's systemic change happening in real time. Madeline nodded slowly. I had coffee with someone last week, a woman who'd followed my story and finally found the courage to confront her business partner about uncredited work. She told me I'd saved her career. She paused, and I realized that's what all of this is for. Not revenge on Ethan, not even justice for myself. It's about creating pathways for other women to save themselves. Ethan, speaking of which, Margaret said carefully, I heard he's trying to launch a new venture, some kind of consulting firm. Madeline felt a flicker of curiosity, but no anger. How's that going for him? Poorly, from what I understand. Turns out building a reputation on stolen brilliance doesn't translate into actual strategic capability. Margaret paused. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never found that text message? If you'd just continued working invisibly? I used to, Madeline admitted, but not anymore. Because I realized that even if I'd never discovered the affair, the erasure would have continued. Eventually, he would have discarded me anyway. The betrayal was inevitable once he decided my value was in what I could give him rather than who I was. And now? Now I know exactly who I am, Madeline said firmly. I'm the strategist who rebuilt her career on her own terms. I'm the founder who created pathways for other women to reclaim their professional identities. I'm the CEO who proved that ethical business practices aren't just theoretical ideals, but practical realities. She turned from the window to face Margaret fully. I'm not someone's hidden wife anymore. I'm not someone's uncredited strategist. I'm Madeline Carter, and the world knows my name. Margaret smiled. Yes, they do. That evening, alone in her office after everyone else had gone home, Madeline opened her laptop and began writing. Not a strategy memo or a business plan, but something more personal. A letter to the woman she'd been 2 years ago, standing in her bedroom with Ethan's phone in her hand, feeling her world shatter. Dear Madeline, she wrote, right now you're terrified. You've just discovered that the man you love has been systematically erasing you while planning to discard you. You feel small and powerless and utterly invisible, but I need you to know something. You are none of those things. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing certainty. You are brilliant. Every strategy Ethan has claimed as his own came from your mind. Every success he celebrated was built on your foundation. That brilliance doesn't disappear just because someone refuses to acknowledge it. She paused, thinking about the past 2 years, the fear and anger and determination that had carried her through. The road ahead is going to be hard. You'll have to make yourself visible in ways that feel terrifying. You'll have to stand in ballrooms and courtrooms and conference rooms and claim your contributions publicly. You'll face skepticism and criticism and people who'd prefer you stay invisible. But you're going to do it anyway, because you'll discover something more important than comfort. You'll discover your worth. Madeline sat back, reading over what she'd written. 2 years from now, you'll stand in an office that bears your name, leading a company built on the principles you fought for. You'll run a foundation that helps other women reclaim what was stolen from them. You'll look in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back, powerful, acknowledged, free. She saved the document, though she'd never send it anywhere. It wasn't for anyone else. It was simply a record of transformation, a marker of how far she'd traveled from invisibility to recognition. Her phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Congratulations on an incredible day. Proud to be your partner in all of this. Dinner next week to discuss the Milan expansion?" Madeline smiled and typed her response. "Absolutely. I have some strategic frameworks that could work well for the Italian market. Full attribution, of course." Victor's reply came quickly. "Wouldn't have it any other way." She gathered her things and prepared to leave, taking one last look around the office that represented everything she'd fought for and won. The nameplate on her desk caught the last rays of sunset, gleaming with quiet certainty. Madeline Carter, co-CEO, Carter Alvarez International. Not hidden, not invisible. Not someone's uncredited strategist. Just herself. Finally, completely, triumphantly, herself. She turned off the lights and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against marble floors with the sound of absolute certainty. Behind her, the office settled into darkness. Ahead, the city glittered with possibility. She was no longer the woman Ethan had tried to keep hidden. She was the mind he could never replace, the brilliance he'd never really owned, the architect who'd built an empire and then rebuilt herself. And everyone, from the women she was helping to the industry she was transforming to the world that had finally learned her name, everyone knew it. The elevator doors closed, and Madeline descended toward street level, toward home, toward a future she'd constructed with her own hands and her own mind and her own unshakable determination to be seen. She stepped out into the spring evening, the city alive around her with countless stories of struggle and triumph, invisibility and recognition, stolen brilliance and hard-won reclamation. But tonight, walking through streets that hummed with possibility, Madeline Carter carried only one story, her own. And it was exactly the story she'd always deserved to tell.